This is Audible.
Devil May Fall, a dark sci-fi mafia enemies to lovers romance, The Devils of Vitality. Written by Chani Lynn Feener. Narrated by L.B. Tran. Author's Note. Dear reader, even if you've read one of my books before, please do not skip this note. As some of the triggers couldn't be included on the book's main listing, I wanted to take the time to include them here. This book is a dark romance, and as such, it contains certain situations and themes not suitable for all readers. Both Flix Fulmini and Ineski Kendricks work for criminal organizations and have major issues. Flix is possessive and always thinks he knows best, whereas Ineski is bitter and desperate, and that desperation often pushes him to do some horrible and questionable things. I want to be clear that I don't condone anything that takes place in this book in real life. This book is purely fiction. These characters are not real, and this takes place on a made-up planet in a made-up galaxy. None of my characters are human, though I sometimes use the word humanoid, and this galaxy is nowhere near ours. If you or someone you know is ever in a toxic relationship, please seek help. You deserve better. Flix and Ineski take advantage of each other throughout the entire book. There's kidnapping, sexual torture, and loads of manipulation and coercion on both sides. At some point in the book, one of them is burned by a cigarette and the other self-harms. Though neither of these events occur more than once, it's important to mention them early. If either of these things will trigger you, please skip this book, even if they happen briefly. If you're looking for characters that always use sane, rational thinking and don't let their emotions get the best of them, these aren't the guys for you. Now on to the rest of the triggers. If you aren't easily triggered or you want to avoid potential spoilers, feel free to skip the rest of this note. I tried to note down all of the ones I can think of, but please keep in mind I may have missed one or two. Your mental health is important. If any of these do not sound appealing or may put you at risk, please skip this book. I have other books that don't fall under the dark category that may be better suited for you. Most, but possibly not all, notable triggers include non-con, dub-con, bondage, kidnapping, stalking, being burned, self-harm once, captivity, manipulation, exhibitionism, violence, murder, torture, death or other characters, and graphic sex scenes. There are many scenes that include filming of the two of them having sex or full exhibitionism, which I know some people aren't into even reading about. To be clear, though, there is no humiliation, and the exhibitionism scene is fully consensual, if not a bit coerced. And finally, lube is only sometimes and sort of used. I know this is a deal breaker for some. Please keep in mind, these are not humans, and only practice safe sex in your real lives. Again, this book does have a HEA. Still, this relationship is messy, with both of the main characters possessive and jealous more often than not. I in no way, shape, or form condone anything mentioned above in real life. This is purely fiction. This book is intended for a mature adult audience only. Remember, your mental health and well-being are more important than reading this book. Always put yourself first and be responsible for your own triggers. You're worth it and you matter. Blurb. A devil of vitality always courts chaos. Ineski Kendricks wants to know what happened to his brother, and why he was so brutally tossed aside by the one person who should have stuck by him after Russ's death. It took 3 years of hard work climbing that ladder to gain leadership of the Shepherd Gang, but he's finally in a position to demand answers, even from the devil himself. Too bad the devil and the man he used to all but worship are one and the same. Ineski's plan has always been to get revenge, and not just for his brother, though that's what he tells his friends. He wants to know what happened to Russ, true, but he also wants to know why he was abandoned. If only revenge was as easy as it sounded. Once he's got Flix where he wants him, it should be, but Ani's old emotions keep getting in the way. Will his pent-up desire cost him his last shred of decency? What did it say about him that he could still want the man, who possibly murdered his brother. Flix Fulmini is a runner by trade. As the official runner/fixer of the Brummel Mafia, he's got sneaking around and secret keeping down to an art form. Aneski is just a name on a long list of them he's withholding information from, and out of all of those names, he's the last person Flix feels threatened by. Which is why it's so shocking when he's kidnapped on Vale University campus and wakes up chained to a wall drenched in ice water. Even more surprising is realizing who his captor is. 3 years ago, Flix left Aneski behind, but the guy has been holding a grudge ever since. Not to mention the fact he's convinced Flix has something to do with his brother's death, which he isn't entirely wrong about. Flix has been hiding more than a few things, and for a good reason. But when Aneski sinks his claws into him and yanks some of those secrets out, Flix has a tough decision to make. Kill Ani before he can tattle to the Brummel, or force him to his knees. Flix originally left for Aneski's own good, but now that he's come calling, it's getting harder and harder for him to turn away. Pretty soon, he starts wondering why he should even bother. In the past, Ani was this close to becoming his. Perhaps claiming him would be the best way to teach him a lesson. He let Aneski escape him once, but no one messed with the devil and left with their freedom intact. Prologue. He hovered in the doorway to the funeral home, uncertainty causing him to keep one foot out the door. There were many reasons he shouldn't be here, and yet Flix had been unable to stay away. At his back, the sky was raging, heavy sheets of rain pattering on the ground, causing his hackles to rise. There were few things he hated more than rain or getting wet, which meant the weather should have offered another deterrent and kept him home. 19 years old and still unable to control himself. Flix grimaced, thinking of what Russ would say if he were here, at his funeral. It'd been a long time since he'd felt the same connection with Russ as he used to, even longer since he'd fully understood what the other guy was thinking. They never seemed to see eye to eye anymore, especially when it came to Russ's latest scheme. The only reason Flix had agreed to meet with him at all had been in honor of their past and the guy's younger brother. But now he was here, dressed in a white suit, attending the death rites of a person he'd known for most of his life, unsure if he'd even be welcomed. Fucking Russ. This was all his fault. Flix should have listened when Berga warned him, but he'd been stubborn. There were very few people on the planet he was actually nice to, and unfortunately, Russ had fallen into that category. But no longer. This was it, the final hurrah. After today, "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" A sharp voice pulled Flix from his thoughts a second before a tall man around his age stormed down the short hallway toward him. The actual ceremony was taking place in the main room, just beyond that hall, and Flix had only caught sight of the flower arrangements and some of the other mourners from where he'd stopped at the entrance. Bowser Kita, one of the 3 founding members of the Shepherd Gang, shoved him as soon as he was in range. "Well, I asked you a damn question, Brummel." Flix allowed the first blow, but when the second came, he latched onto Bowser's wrist, holding him steady. Of the two of them, he was the strongest here, and it wasn't just because he was Brummel and had been trained by the Mafia his entire life. Bowser was upset over the loss of his friend. But Flix was absolutely gutted because he'd given up something far more important. Bowser had gained a stronger footing within his gang with Russ's absence. Flix had more to lose. "I know you had something to do with this," Bowser hissed, though his voice lowered, and when he yanked himself free, he didn't attempt to hit him again. "Got any proof?" "The Brummel attacked us that day," he snapped. "There are plenty of witnesses." Flix held his ground and simply repeated, "Proof, Bowser? Do you have any? Careful who you go around accusing." "Why? You going to off me like you did Russ?" He shook his head, a hint of disgust in his gaze. "He was your friend. I knew the Brummel were cruel, but I didn't realize you lot were also this disloyal to the people you supposedly care about. Even if you weren't there that day, even if you didn't know what was happening, you should have done something." Only Flix had been there that day. Eventually, they might even find out. If these witnesses had seen more than they were letting on, he definitely would be. Ideally, this would be settled long before then. All he could do for now was let his people take the blame and stand firm. That'd been the agreement after all, and contrary to what Bowser now believed, loyalty was everything to Flix. There was an argument, and apparently things got heated. Flix lifted a shoulder in a shrug. Shit happens. Did you seriously just make a joke about it? Bowser grabbed him by the collar and shook him. He's suffocated from smoke inhalation, and you're making jokes? Pretty sure there wasn't enough left of him to confirm that cause of death. Betesi. Flix and Bowser both froze at the new voice, the latter letting Flix go and stepping away. Aneski. Bowser turned toward the younger man as he approached. You don't have to deal with this. Go back inside, I'll make sure he leaves. No. Ani shook his head. Tearful gaze locked onto Flix. I want him here. I want to talk to him. Bowser frowned and stepped closer, resting a hand on Aneski's arm. Flix inhaled slowly, telling himself to keep still, reminding himself that he didn't have the right to be jealous or angry at how close the two of them were standing to one another. Bowser had the right to comfort as Russ's best friend. Who was Flix? Who was he to Aneski? Just because the younger guy called him Bitesi, a term used for an older male who one was either close to or related to, didn't mean Flix was anything special. Hell, even if it did, the usage of the term could mean he'd already been brother-zoned. He didn't think of Ani as a brother, but that didn't mean the feeling was mutual. In light of what's happened, Bowser tentatively began, I don't think it's wise to let him linger. He was Russ's. His people are the reason we're here, Bowser snapped, and this time, when that caused Ani to flinch, Flix couldn't hold back his reaction. He grabbed Aneski and eased him away from Bowser, giving a warning look when the other man tried to stop him. Once there were a few feet separating them, he turned to Ani, brushing his fingers lightly through the younger man's ginger hair, fixing the wild strands. Aneski, Russ's only surviving family member, was dressed as the head mourner. The white suit with the crimson collar, detailing on the sleeves, and triangular shoulders separated him from the rest, but also somehow highlighted his age. There was only a year and a half between them, but Ani had always seemed a lot more innocent than either Flix or his brother Russ. Now he was heading a funeral on his own, the most adult thing a person could do. Flix opened his mouth and it was on the tip of his tongue to offer his assistance. He knew how to run a death rite, having attended many in the past, knew how much work and energy it took. He ended up dropping his hands and saying nothing instead. Because Bowser was correct about one thing. Flix was partially to blame for this. He'd given away his right to comfort Aneski. Can you tell me what happened? Ani asked then, looking up at him with a mixture of pain and hope. It was the latter that tore Flix apart. They said there was a fight with the Brummel, and then a fire. Everyone else got out. Why didn't my brother? Do you know anything? Yes, he knew everything. But he couldn't tell him any of it. It wasn't his place. When it came to Ani, apparently Flix didn't have one. I'm not sure, he ended up replying. The police report said there was faulty wiring in the building and that's what caused it. It was an accident. Why couldn't he get out? Aneski demanded, though with less aggression than Bowser had used. He still believed in Flix, still trusted him. How did everyone else? Something had to have happened, something more that someone isn't confessing to. He had to have been unconscious, Bowser cut in, glaring at Flix as if daring him to deny it. Someone knocked him out and left him there. Either because the fire started and they panicked, or on purpose. Are you accusing us of starting the fire? Flix asked, even though it was obvious that's exactly what he was doing. Someone saw a blonde flee the scene just before the place was fully engulfed. Blondes make up 37% of Vitality's population, he pointed out, motioning between them. You'll need more than that if you want to accuse me. Stop it, Aneski told Bowser. Flix wouldn't do something like that. Not to. He caught himself and swallowed before finishing a bit more softly. Not to Russ. Flix took a step back, and when all eyes turned to him, he focused only on Ani. I'm going to go. What? No. He grabbed his sleeve and held strong. Stay, please. I don't want to be alone. You aren't alone. He motioned toward Bowser and down the hall. There are a lot of people here to support you. I need you, Betessi. You don't. Flix removed his hand, but held it a moment longer than he should, memorizing the feel of Ani's palm against his. This wouldn't be the last time he got to do this, but there was no telling how the future would go. Whether or not Aneski would be able to forgive him once he knew the truth. You'll get through this, Ani. You're stronger than you think. No, Bowser pulled Aneski away from Flix, cutting him off in the process. Flix took a step toward them on instinct, catching himself at the last second. His hands were balled into fists, and all he could picture was bashing the other guy's skull against the wall, or, better yet, electrocuting him. But he couldn't do either of those things. He couldn't do anything at all. It took all his willpower, but he made his body ease, dropping into a relaxed stance that most certainly wasn't appropriate for a funeral. He smiled at Aneski. I'll see you around, Tiny Terror. Flix, wait! Bowser must have stopped Ani from coming after him because Flix could hear the sounds of their struggles as he stepped into the pouring rain and dropped down the steps, taking his time with it as though he didn't have a care in the world. As if he hadn't just torn his heart out and given up on the one thing in his entire life he'd actually ever wanted for himself. All because he was a man of his word. For Ani's sake, Russ better be as well. Ice-cold water slapped across his naked body, and Flix sputtered awake, mind scrambling to tear through the dream memory and piece together what was currently going on. He'd been on his way to follow out one of Michael Void's orders. The Dominus, or leader of the Brummel Mafia, had sent him to do some errands he couldn't recall. Nothing special, nothing that should have resulted in him here, wet and restrained. Flix tugged at his wrists and ankles, grinding his teeth when he realized he was held tightly to the wall at his back with metal cuffs. There was also one around his neck, restricting how much he could turn his head. Not that it mattered, since he was also wearing a thick blindfold that didn't even allow in a bit of light. How long had he been out? What time was it now? The only thing he knew for sure was he wasn't alone. Someone had to have doused him in water, but there was no one bold enough to kidnap a Brummel member that came to mind. I have questions, a modulated voice said then. Whoever was using the device wasn't even trying to hide the fact that they were. It was of low enough quality that it cracked at the end. So his kidnapper didn't have money. That ruled out a good chunk of possible enemies. Flix swallowed, his throat dry, no doubt from whatever drug they'd rigged his car to fill up with. He vaguely remembered turning the vehicle on and then all of the doors locking on him. Smoke had poured through the vents, the sweet smell unmistakable. He'd gone for his dashboard where he typically kept a gas mask, but it'd been missing. A moment later, Flix had passed out. And now he was here, naked and chained and fucking wet. Did his kidnapper know something he shouldn't? The first real inkling of worry wormed its way through him, but he forced himself to remain stoic on the outside. He'd chosen to develop a flippant persona on purpose. People tended to let their guard down and underestimate a person like that. After years of carefully crafting it, it was easy enough for him to slip on that mask. Could have just called, Flix said, noting that he didn't sound all that bad, all things considered. Internally, he checked himself, trying to gauge whether he felt hot or jittery anywhere. As far as he could tell, he was fine. Another good sign. He'd been taken at the best time, really. It'd only been a few days since he'd last leached. That gave him roughly a month before his body wouldn't be able to take anymore, and he'd either spontaneously combust or... Actually, he wasn't entirely certain. But whatever it was, it wouldn't be pretty. A month was more than enough time. He wasn't overly concerned. 3 years ago, there was a fight at the dive, the man in front of him said. You were there. Flix felt a brush of unease. What of it? You're not even bothering to deny it? Why should I? He replied. Clearly you know something already, otherwise you wouldn't have taken a risk like this. Kind of stupid, by the way. Why throw your life away over an event that took place years ago? There had been more than one casualty that afternoon, but only one recorded death. Russ's best friend had moved away, and there was no one else who'd give a shit about him, aside from one person. Oneski wasn't capable of something like this, though. He would never. The man stepped forward and Flix got a whiff of him. An earthy smell, coupled with the tart scent of apples. It altered some in the 3 years since they'd been alone in the same room, but not enough that Flix didn't recognize it. He'd recognize it anywhere. That particular smell still haunted his dreams. I want to know what went down that day, the man stated. You're going to tell me in detail. Take off the blindfold. Flix needed to see him. You don't get to make demands here. Take off, he yelped, and then clenched his jaw shut to prevent any other sounds from slipping past his defenses when his exposed dick was grabbed suddenly. He felt something cold and metallic slip over it, and then around it, but shifting his hips did nothing to dislodge the hold the man had on him. As soon as he was finished, the man stepped back, and the sound of a bottle cap popping open filled the room. What the hell are you doing? Flix was admittedly thrown for a loop. This, the man tapped his dick, causing Flix to growl, is a cock cage. I'm sure you're familiar. No, I know for a fact that you are. And this, he stepped in close enough Flix could feel the heat radiating off his body, and then reached around him. Flix tried to struggle a second time, but with just as much success. His cheeks were pried apart, and then something blunt and sticky was pressed against his entrance. He went still. What? This is a butt plug, the man told him, slowly shoving the toy inside of him, chuckling when Flix ground his teeth against the sudden intrusion. It'd been lubed up, so the glide-in was slick, and the toy itself wasn't very large, maybe slightly thicker than a finger. But Flix wasn't used to taking anything up there, and there was still a moment of discomfort and mild irritation. You're seriously going to regret this, he said, as soon as he felt the toy fit in snugly, and the man stepped away again. The man made a non-committal sound in the back of his throat. I already regret ever knowing of your existence. What's one more disappointment added to the list? Flix flinched before he could help it. Think about what I asked you while I'm gone. The man moved further away. If you tell me what I want to know when I'm back, I'll remove the toys. If you don't... He let his words draw out, the threat open-ended. Not that Flix cared about that part. He'd been planning on answering all of his questions about that day before the man had pulled this bullshit on him. Now, his kidnapper was going to seriously regret choosing this route. Flix was a man of his word, after all. Chapter 1. Rage, misery, loneliness, grief, heartache. He ran down the list of what had sort of become a personal mantra for him. 5 emotions to match the things he'd felt these past 3 years, like his own version of the 5 stages of grief. His skin felt like it was buzzing, a mixture of all of the above filling him up to the point he thought he was about to explode. The camera in the corner with its tiny red flashing light showing it was recording helped calm him some, but only just. Something about creating physical evidence, a tangible thing he could turn to later once he left this place and returned to his regularly scheduled program, helped ease some of the turmoil in his gut. Was it strange to be soothed by an illegally made sex tape? Sure. But murder was also illegal, and if the man currently writhing on the floor at his feet was any indicator, getting away with crime on this planet was a piece of cake. Oneski brought the end of the cigarette to his lips and took a deep drag, hoping the burrow grass inside would steady his nerves further, enough so he could get this show on the damn road. How long had he been standing there, watching? 5 minutes? 10? If he was to count every moment from the beginning when he'd first dragged the man in here, it'd been a total of 2 weeks. 2 weeks and the blonde had yet to break. Aneski would expect nothing less from the infamous Flix Fomini. But enough was enough, no matter how much he enjoyed watching. It was only a matter of time before Flix's mafia members realized he wasn't on the supposed vacation Aneski had made them believe and came looking for him. He'd covered his tracks, but the Brummel were in a whole other league. They'd find them eventually, and when they did, Aneski would lose his chance. He crouched, trailing his gaze down Flix's muscular back, watching as the other man strained against the chains, despite knowing already there was no use. In the weeks he'd been there, Aneski had been kind enough to readjust them now and then. Twice a day, they flooded this room with knockout gas, then came in and unhooked him. The stuff wasn't too potent, so he woke within 10 minutes and was allowed to move into the bathroom to do his business and shower. Rexton typically oversaw that since Aneski couldn't justify being here 24/7. But he sometimes watched the footage after, just to be sure Flix wasn't up to anything funny that Rex might miss. Any in-person questioning was typically done by Rexton as well, since the shitty voice modulator they purchased broke after one use. He could manage this, though. And not just because he loathed the idea of anyone else getting to see the Brummel runner this way. For my eyes only, Aneski whispered to himself, snorting over his own stupid joke. Despite the whir of the machine pumping in and out of his abused hole, Flix must have heard him, because he tipped his head slightly in his direction. He couldn't do much, since his head was already lowered, his cheek pressed to the ground, held there by the metal collar around his neck. The collar connected to loops that encircled his shoulders, forcing them slightly back, and a mess of ropes created from metallic wires trailed down from there to his waist. His wrists had been secured to his sides, his knees spread and connected to the floor by thick strips of metal that were bolted down. The whole setup allowed for very little movement. The most he could do was rock back and forth a bit. His friend had accused Aneski of it being too much and unnecessary, but Aneski disagreed. Rexton had seen the contraption when Aneski had been setting everything up in here, but he'd never seen Flix displayed in it. He hadn't seen the way Flix had almost torn the bolts from the floor that first day, before Aneski had added another. Now, they were permanently set in the ground, and a key was needed to twist them enough to remove the metal cuffs pinning Flix down. Flix's ass was high in the air, and Aneski shifted, leaning so he could take a look at the thrusting dildo he'd shoved inside the other man's body an hour or so ago before he'd left for class. The muscle was beet red now, a mixture of lube and a hint of dried blood from when he'd inserted it visible. The toy lubricated every 10 minutes on its own, but it'd run out soon. If Aneski chose to leave again, Flix would be left taking it dry within another hour's time. At the base of the toy, another metal loop was attached, leading down to the cock cage. Flix's full sack was as scarlet as his beat-up hole, and before he understood what he intended, Aneski reached out and grabbed at it, rolling his balls in his palm. Flix jerked and made a strangled sound behind the tight black gag, the matching blindfold concealing what was no doubt a murderous glare. With a dark chuckle, he released him and then plucked out the cigarette, hesitating only for a split second before bringing the burning side to the swell of one of Flix's ass cheeks. He thought it would satisfy him, but watching the skin burn beneath the tiny flicker of flame only had his stomach churning, and Aneski pulled it away and flicked it across the room with a scowl. He couldn't afford to be this weak. Couldn't afford to feel anything remotely like guilt or remorse. This was Flix's fault. This was what he deserved. Aneski slapped him with an open palm as hard as he could across that same cheek, sure to hit the burn mark, and Flix made an animalistic growling sound. When he'd been younger, Aneski had idolized the Brummel member currently at his mercy. In his twisted teenage fantasies, he never would have even imagined having him trapped like this, his to do with as he pleased. Back then, Flix had been larger than life, worth more reverence than light. Aneski would have cut off his own left nut just for a chance to kneel before him and worship at his altar, preferably with his cock in his mouth. It was funny how quickly things could change, how one bad decision could eviscerate an entire perception of a person from your mind. Flix used to be the avenging angel in Aneski's life he prayed to come and take him. Now, he was the devil that needed slaying. But not before Aneski had retrieved his retribution and his answers. He shut the toy off and yanked it out of Flix's hole carelessly, dropping it without a second thought. That gaping cavern pulsed before starting to close up, and Aneski gave it a moment, allowing Flix a second to hope that maybe this time he would let it. No chance in hell. Just before it could fully close, Aneski shoved in the locking butt plug, pushing the metal toy as deep as it could go before twisting the ring to lock it into place inside of the pissed off and exhausted Brummel member. Then he reached down and undid the cock cage, wrapping his fingers around Flix even as he immediately started to harden. He stroked him to full length, enjoying the way the hot flesh burned against his, and the slick glide of pre-cum against his palm. This little ritual of theirs was his favorite part, mostly because he knew out of everything being done to him, this was what Flix despised the most. A top like Flix, used to being in control of everything and everyone, would feel emasculated by being forced to come for a stranger he couldn't see. There was a chance he'd fallen for the trick and thought that Rexton was his sole captor, but Aneski had his doubts. Flix had always been too smart for his own good, after all. Honestly, though, Aneski kind of liked that too. Liked lying in his warm, safe bed at night, imagining Flix in here freaking out, trying to guess who it was that fucked him day in and out. It was a daily occurrence that wouldn't stop either, not until he finally broke and told Aneski what he wanted to know. Not until Aneski felt better about being abandoned after that one sweet night they'd shared years ago. The night Flix seemed to have forgotten entirely. "If you weren't so pig-headed," he whispered, knowing Flix could still hear him, "we could stop meeting like this." Although, he tugged on his cock a little harder than necessary. "Maybe you like it? That it? Big bad fixer, like being taken advantage of by little old me?" It was telling to call him that, since his title as runner within the Brummel was more well known, but Aneski was feeling emboldened by the mixture of emotions coursing through him. Flix mumbled something behind the gag, and even though he'd managed to resist for half a month already, Aneski found his free hand stretching out. His pointer finger looped into the drenched material and slipped it down to the blonde's chin. "What's that? If you're going to, I don't like sticking my dick up ass," Aneski cut him off. "But that doesn't mean I don't enjoy watching you take all the toys I picked out for you." Flix grit his teeth and then stated, "I was going to say kill me." "Oh." He continued to work his flushed cock with his hand as they spoke. "That's not what I want from you." "Reconsider," Flix surprised them by saying, "because once I'm free, I'm coming for you. And for the record, I do like sticking my dick up ass. I'm going to tear through yours." Aneski pulled the gag back up and shifted uncomfortably on his heels. He'd already been semi-hard from the view, but how he'd felt himself thicken to full mast behind his tight jeans. He didn't want to be turned on by Flix's threats, but as per usual, when it came to this particular Brummel member, Aneski's body was a traitor. Things could have been so different between them. If only he hadn't betrayed Ani. He finished Flix off silently, giving a satisfied sigh when his cock finally unloaded. Usually, he'd clean him off a bit, but knowing he was at the end of his rope, Aneski opted to leave him kneeling in his own juices instead. Standing, he hesitated, mouth opening and closing several times before he gave up on coming up with anything witty and simply left. When the door slammed shut behind him, he tried not to think about the time a younger version of himself had been scolded by Flix for doing the exact same thing. With any luck, it pissed the blonde off just as much now as it did then. Chapter 2. His mouth was dry and his shoulders ached, but Flix kept those discomforts to himself as he waited for the man standing across from him to speak. He knew it was a man despite the blindfold, the same way he knew they were the only two in the room at the moment. The smell. It was like buttered popcorn, strong and constant whenever this one visited, which was every morning and evening, like clockwork. Flix had figured out the pattern early on, though, since he had no concept of how long he'd been unconscious beforehand, it was impossible to know exactly how long he'd been locked up here. If he had to guess, it was at least 3 weeks now. Where the fuck was Berga? In the beginning, he'd been told by the popcorn-smelling one that his friends wouldn't be coming for him, that they'd been informed he was going on vacation or some such bullshit. Honestly, he'd inwardly laughed at that because the last time he'd taken a vacation from the Brummel, he'd been 6. Alas, apparently, he had to concede that whatever they told the others, it'd been good. Clearly, they all believed them since no one had broken down the door and come to his rescue yet. Typically, he'd save himself and not bother waiting. However, his kidnappers, because there were 2 of them, he was positive, were either seriously lucky or knew something about him that they shouldn't. All of his restraints were made out of metal. If he tried anything funny, he'd only end up shocking himself. Not ideal. Though, if this kept up for much longer, the choice would soon be taken out of his hands. If he didn't leech within the next week or so, his shout abilities would bubble over, and he'd end up using them without meaning to. It wasn't just the metal that was stopping him, it was knowing every single second he was here was being recorded. A few generations back, Flix's family had traveled to this planet from another. At the time, they'd been relatively powerful and had come with the Voids to help form their own mafia on a flourishing world instead of the dying one they'd fled from. Both the Fulminis and the Voids were shouts by blood, but there hadn't been a member in Flix's family that had shout abilities in a long time. At least, that's what everyone believed. Flix couldn't be the one to spill that secret. He may be close with Beichel, but betrayal was still betrayal, and things were already rocky now that there'd been a change of power. Beichel could more than handle the Brummel, but there would be pressure from older members to punish the Fulminis if this got out. So, he'd been forced to grin and bear it and allow his captors to run the show. And what an absolutely fucked up and confusing show it was. Trying to decide if you want to go the route of more sexual torture, Flix gave in and broke the silence first, though he chose his words carefully so as not to tip his hand. The popcorn man wasn't the one who got off on that type of thing, but he didn't need to know that Flix had caught on to their little ruse. For some reason, they wanted him to believe there was one of them acting alone. The first break had come last week, when the one who was into shoving things up his ass had broken his silence and whispered to him. There was little doubt in Flix's mind that he was watching this exchange now, or that he would watch it later, and it was being recorded. That was the one in charge. Popcorn Man was merely acting out his orders. But the sadistic fuck who assaulted Flix with toys every day was clearly losing patience. If he kept pushing them, he'd crack sooner or later, and then Flix could hopefully find an opening and a way out of this mess. He just had to keep playing dumb. His specialty. "Tell me about Russ," the popcorn man demanded. He kept his distance. From the sound of his heels clipping against the solid stone ground as he paced, he was at least 5 or so feet away. "Are you afraid of getting too close?" Flix teased, tugging at the metal cuffs that secured his wrists to the wall. There was also one at his neck and around his ankles. They definitely weren't taking any risks where he was concerned. He was still trying to decide if he should be flattered or frustrated. What? Only good for it during the day? He had no clue if it was actually daylight hours or not, only that the pattern had a beginning and end, and this was the end portion. That's when the interrogation began, the questions always a mixture of the same boring flavors. Telling flavors as well, but Flix hadn't let that on either. Mostly because until he knew exactly what was going on and why, he wasn't about to tip any of his hand. That, and they didn't deserve it. Maybe if it'd been a regular beating, like usual, Flix would have given an inch after he'd figured out who one of his captors was. But because of the sexual torture, nah. It also made it obvious that even if he was honest, they wouldn't believe him. Why bother if he was only going to be called a liar? Russ, the man repeated tightly. You two dated. Dated is a strong word. You used to sleep with him. I sleep with a lot of people. What did you do to him? Flix would have cocked his head if not for the metal bar holding him tight, forcing him to face forward and nowhere else. Aren't you tired of this dance yet? Always the same questions. So then answer them honestly so we can both be done with this. Getting frustrated? Good. Flix clicked his tongue. Come on, you've got to have more stamina than that when dealing with a devil, Popcorn. Don't call me that. Do you only eat that? Or do you bathe in butter, live at the movie theater? I'm trying to paint a picture here. I'm the one who asks the questions. Yeah, but your questions are boring. Seriously, how do you get yourself to smell that way? And also, why? Does your boyfriend get off on it? Flix barely contained the scowl that thought brought, forcing himself to smirk instead, to cover up the almost slip. I don't have a boy... Popcorn stopped himself and cursed. Fuck, man. Can you please just tell me about Russ? Believe it or not, I don't want to be doing this any more than you do. Staring at you naked day in and out is not my idea of a good time. The metal butt plug buried in my ass begs to differ. Prior to this, Flix hadn't been used to taking anything up there, usually the one doing the taking. At first, he'd been super pissed on principle, but now, well, actually, he was still pissed. But only because he was typically left in blissed out suspension for hours at a time, which pushed him well past overstimulation. It might have worked even. He'd found himself almost giving in, desperate to come, but then he'd secretly confirmed who his captor was, the one who liked to fill him up and lock his cock in a cage, and that had changed everything. Sorry, no matter how many times you ask it, my answer isn't going to change. Russ? Flix clicked his tongue. Doesn't ring a bell. It rang the whole church. But only good boys deserved answers. And his captor, the real one, the one in charge of this shit show, yeah, he was the opposite of well-behaved. Eventually, Flix was going to teach him the lesson of a lifetime, but until then, he'd have some fun with it. Why not? Wasn't like he was going anywhere. He chuckled at his own dumb joke and could practically feel the confusion radiating off of Popcorn. Maybe he'd get lucky and the guy would think he was starting to lose his mind locked up in this infinite loop. A weaker man would have, but sexual acts aside, Flix had undergone way worse than this during training for his position within the Brummel. His seat at Bike Void's table meant he'd gone through the ringer to earn it. It would take a lot more than this to get him to break. Though, admittedly, he was getting pretty tired of having his body used for someone else's amusement. Not that he was obtuse enough to truly believe that's all that it was. That was what they wanted him to think, of course. They wanted him to feel humiliated and burn with anger every time the leader forced something unyielding into his body. Too bad for them, as soon as Flix had identified him, that reaction was off the table. Instead, Flix was keeping score, and he'd get even, with interest. Damn, his cock was threatening to swell just thinking about it. What about what happened the day he was killed? Popcorn shifted gears like he always did. People saw you there. Was I? He had been. Yes, you were the last one seen talking to Russ. Didn't that supposedly go down at the mall? Flix clicked his tongue. Dude, hate to break it to you, but I was most likely asking for directions to Pole's Pretzels. That garlic butter cheese sauce they have, to die for, literally. Popcorn went silent. Oh, did you catch the threat that time? Flix teased. I was starting to wonder if you were an idiot. So many of them have gone over your head these past weeks we've been playing. This isn't a game, Popcorn stated, but his voice had dropped an octave, and it was too obvious Flix had struck a nerve. Do you think it's funny? Russ wasn't just some trash on the streets, he was cared about. He had friends and family who've been haunted all of these years by the mysterious way he died. Don't you care even a little? Weren't you friends with him? That was a stretch, but he'd let Popcorn continue believing it if he needed to. Not many people liked Russ. Hell, not even Flix had liked him by the end. He'd been a selfish, overly eager prick, always after finding a shortcut. Screw the high road. If there was a low road, Russ would take it. That was just the kind person he was. Friends and family? He had maybe 2 friends on a good day, and only 1 surviving family member, who Flix was picturing on his back with his thighs spread around his waist. Him who? Flix dared to push Popcorn's boundaries a bit more, curious to see how far he could get the other guy to crack. He'd misspoken just now, and there was no way in hell Flix wasn't about to take advantage of that. You referring to Russ still, Popcorn, or someone else? I meant his loved ones, he quickly backtracked, but it was a bald-faced lie, and Flix didn't even need to be able to see him to catch on to that fact. Ah, he pretended to make some grand revelation. You mean the brat, don't you? Yeah, I remember now. Russ had a brother, clingy little thing. Don't tell me. There's no way you're him, right? He was not. 3 weeks of torture, though, and this was the best opportunity Flix had seen. What was your name again? Something with an E? Word of advice, stop talking. Giving me advice now too, Popcorn? Wait, was it Eskel? Ezekiel? Eben? No, none of those sound right. Forget the advice. Do me a solid and give me a hint. Popcorn swore. Seriously, stop fucking around. Isn't that what I should be saying? Flix countered. Stop fucking around, Ezra or Emin or whatever the hell your name is. Trying to get revenge for Big Brother is all well and dandy, but this? He rattled the chains as best he could. This is too far. Shut up. That's not even his name. Popcorn cursed again, frazzled, which meant this was somehow personal for him as well. He might not be Russ's little brother, because Flix knew exactly who that was, but there was a connection there Flix was missing. Or maybe one he'd clocked but was trying not to think of, even though it was ridiculous of him to try and push it away. Russ may not have been popular, but his brother had friends. Real ones. Ones that had stuck with him over the years. You dating him then? Flix asked, trying to stay calm even as he pictured the single bastard friend who clearly had a crush. Had he been successful finally? Convinced Ani to give them a shot? Was he Popcorn? Little brother, I mean. You seem invested. Afraid I'll hurt his tiny feelings? No, I'm afraid you'll push him so far he'll make things worse by murdering a devil of vitality, Popcorn snapped. Worse? Flix chuckled darkly. Sorry to burst your delusional bubble, but that ship has sailed. The second I'm out of here, I'll find you and string you up. Better yet, how about I chain you here and force you to watch as I fuck your boyfriend until he screams my name and begs me to stop? If Popcorn and Ineski were actually dating, that threat might not be as hollow as he'd intended for it to be. What? You think you guys could screw me this many times and not have to go through it yourselves? Turnabout is fair play. You're not very good at this, are you? He pretended to think things over. My guess is you're Shepherd. The Brumo Mafia only had one rival on planet, and it was honestly a kindness to call them that. The Shepherds were nothing but a low-level gang who wanted to play dress-up and pretend they were badasses when, in reality, they were thugs at best and a mild nuisance at worst. Vitality had an official emperor and imperial family who ran the planet, however, and it was well known throughout the universe that the Brumal had ties to everything that went on. The Void's legally operated business brought in more than 30% of the planet's wealth. The Brumal brought in just as much with their underhanded dealings. Together, they pretty much kept things running and ensured everyone here had their pockets lined with enough coin they didn't even think about stepping out of line. The Shepherds were a fairly new gang, formed only a handful of years ago by a group of college students from the poorer side of the capital city, Valio. They'd been left to their own devices since they'd never created any sort of real threat toward the Brumal. However, just as they were about to step in, the original Shepherd leader was taken out and replaced, which was why Flix had been sent to deliver a warning and a pat on the head. Actually, while we're on the topic, I hope change of leadership has done something about the whole name situation. Like, is it Shepard or is it Shephed? Have you come to an agreement where that's concerned? Having your members all spelling it differently is absolutely hilarious, don't get me wrong, but if you want to be taken seriously, you should probably get a handle on that. We aren't shepherds, Popcorn said. Wow, Flix drawled. At least try to sound believable, damn. So you're shepherds. Shocker. He'd known that from the start, considering he'd been on his way to meet with them when his car had filled with gas. It'd taken him a moment to recall, but it'd come to him eventually. Just his luck, they'd been smart enough to knock him out from afar. If he'd stayed conscious, he would have barbecued them on the spot, and none of this would have happened. Well, he would have barbecued Popcorn at least. Probably. You got lucky, he pointed out, keeping his uncertain thoughts to himself. What are the odds you'll stay that way? Popcorn didn't reply, and a moment later, someone pounded on what had to be the closed door to the room they were in. Flix barely resisted the urge to grin triumphantly. Got you. There were two of them, and they'd just confirmed as much. Not that he'd needed it, but it was kind of fun to trip them up. Popcorn cursed a third time and stormed off, swinging the door open hard enough it clattered against the wall. Damn it, why the hell did you do that? You just... The door closed at his back, cutting off whatever else he'd been saying. Flix sighed. Alone yet again. All there was left for him to do was wait in silence and pray the tiny terror took the bait. Chapter 3. Aneski squeezed hard enough to leave indents of his fingers on the statue's neck, releasing only when it became apparent if he didn't, he'd behead the damn thing. And it was due by the end of the day. Weeks spent working on it only to almost destroy at the final hour. He wasn't usually this careless when it came to his art, but he'd been irritable and in a bad mood ever since yesterday when that fucker claimed to have forgotten about him. Asshole. Lying fucking asshole. Flix Fomini was many things, but absent-minded wasn't one of them. There was no way he'd forgotten about Aneski, and no matter how hard the asshole tried to convince him as much, he refused to believe it. Right? Right. Ish. Fuck! He shot to his feet and kicked the stool he'd been sitting on clear across the room, closing his eyes when it clattered against the wall, knocking down someone's hanging canvas. If he'd scratched it at all, he'd feel terrible. Whoa! Rex appeared in the doorway just in time to witness his outburst, grimacing at him as he went to pick up the fallen piece. What the hell, man? Sorry, Aneski mumbled. He ran his hand through his slightly curly ginger hair, scowling when he realized too late that there was still wet clay smeared over his palm. Damn it. First you slipped up at the hideaway, and now this. Rex replaced the canvas. You've let him get to you, man. Didn't you swear you weren't going to let that happen? He should deny it, at least try to save face, but Aneski didn't even bother. Rex was one of the few people in his life who really knew him. Hell, he was the only one he trusted enough to let in on this asinine plan. There was no point in denying what they both already figured out. Aneski had let Flix get to him. Is it because he wasn't wrong, Rex prodded, about us having gotten lucky? There was no other way either of them would have been able to kidnap the Brumal member otherwise. There'd been more to the plan, of course, but it'd still been shaky at best. After years of planning, Aneski still hadn't been able to come up with anything seamless that would guarantee the capture of his brother's ex, and the number one suspect in his brother's murder case, and Ani's first love. Fuck. We were too obvious, Aneski said. He tried to start them off small. They'd kept Flix locked up with no contact for the first few days, carefully monitoring him from the small camera set in the corner of the room they'd converted into a cell fit for containing a devil. It'd been easy though, since Flix hadn't woken once in that time frame. He'd start to worry even. Had called in Bridger and spilled his guts about it, all due to panic he'd somehow killed Flix or permanently put the man in a coma. From the very beginning, Ani had been too close to this. Time apart was meant to have hardened him against his old feelings, but whenever he was alone in the same room with Flix, whenever he forced him to moan and writhe, all those old wants and needs came back tenfold. That's not on me, Rex argued. I followed your lead. I even looked the other way while you sexually... You might not have looked, Aneski cut him off, but you certainly like talking about it. I get it. You're not happy with the way I decided to approach this. Noted. I just don't get why it's relevant. Someone like Flix wouldn't succumb to typical torture methods. Rex quirked a brow. Right, so you decided to spend a small fortune on rotating beaded dildos and locking anal plugs in order to make him talk. Because breaking a couple of his bones wouldn't have done the trick, but letting him get off several times a day will. Sure. He only gets to come once. Aneski blew out a breath when his friend's gaze only hardened at that. Fine. It sounds crazy when you say it out loud. That's because it is crazy. Rex made his way over, stopping a couple of feet away so they were no longer speaking across the room. They were alone, and there wasn't another class due to use the studio space for at least an hour, but that didn't mean someone couldn't walk in at any given moment. And the last thing either of them wanted was to be overheard talking about the kidnap of a Brummel member, let alone one of the Devils of Vitality. You're still grieving, even after all of these years, and I get that, he tentatively began, carefully choosing his words as Aneski waited with less patience for him to get to the point. But you aren't thinking straight. If you thought this whole thing was stupid, why did you agree to help me in the first place? Aneski snapped. I would have asked Gannon. Gannon Fisher had grown up with them and was the second closest person to Aneski. His first matter of business, as soon as Aneski had taken over the Shepherds, had been to raise his friend's status within the gang. He needed people he could fully trust around him, and those were few and far between. Still, he probably wouldn't have asked him to help with this, and they both knew it. Rexton was just nice enough not to point it out. You're like a brother to me, Rex reminded. If you're in pain, I'm in pain, and ever since Russ's death, you haven't been the same. Maybe answers will finally give you the closure that you need and you can stop being... He waved at him, this depressed and angry all the time. I had to help you. Plus, we both know there was nothing I was going to be able to say or do that could convince you not to go through with this. Especially not after Rex had discovered there were more to his reasoning to wanting to take over the Shepherds. He'd known all about how badly Ani wanted to take back the gang his brother helped create, sort of as a honor to Russ's name, but he hadn't known about the other part of Ani's plan. A plan he'd needed serious resources to pull off, ones that the leader of the Shepherds could control. The hideout in the woods where they were currently keeping Flix was purchased property by their original leader, Haroon. It transferred automatically to his successor, which was Aneski, and was the perfect place to serve their purposes. The hideout was secluded and off the beaten path, not the type of place anyone would randomly stumble upon. Since Aneski was in charge of the gang, he'd also made it off limits, so there was extra safety in knowing none of the other members would dare appear there either. There was always the chance that Flix's friends would realize something was off and come looking, and if that happened, they needed a place that also didn't have any accompanying paperwork that could be found and linked back to them. "You're punishing him," Rex said a moment later, clearly frustrated by the lack of progress he was making in this conversation. "That's what all the sex stuff is about, Aneski." He clenched his fists at his sides and, like with earlier, didn't bother denying this either. "My brother cared for that asshole. You cared for him." "Yeah," he practically growled. "I did, because I was also an idiot who didn't know any better. When he'd been 17, he'd come home from school. It'd been like every other day, until it wasn't, with him heading down the long, narrow hall of their tiny 2-bedroom apartment. Only a sound had caught his attention, and he'd paused at his brother's room. The door had been ajar, and when he'd glanced inside, it was to find Russ being plowed by a blonde. Aneski hadn't been able to see Flix's face since they'd been facing the opposite direction, had only gotten a glimpse of his hair and a look at his back before he darted away, embarrassed for all three of them. But he'd known it was Flix with Russ, because who else could it have been? Back then, his brother was always bringing the Brummel member around, even though the two of them were technically enemies now that Russ had helped Haroon form the Shepherds. They'd met when they were kids, even though Ani couldn't recall, before Flix had moved away, and both attended Vail University. Upon meeting again, they'd hit it off or some such nonsense. That was how Russ had explained it anyway. He and Flix were friends. Aneski had always gotten the sense there was more to it since Flix was always going above and beyond what a simple friend would, and after catching them in the act, it was only proven. "He was sleeping with your brother, and you wished it was your bed he was lying in," Rex said. "That's what this is about, isn't it? You couldn't have him then, so you're taking him now?" Wrong. He'd had him. Once. Just once. And that one time was sewn into his psyche, the stitching constantly pulling and tugging at him painfully, making it impossible for him to move on or forget. "This is about forcing him to tell us what he knows," he corrected. "Sure, that too," he agreed, and it sounded like he believed him this time. "But you still want him. Admit it. You're making it sound like this is completely selfish. Like I don't care about Russ at all, and he's just an excuse to be with Flix. That's not what's going on. Being with someone and using them weren't the same. I want him to feel the way I feel." Aneski almost kicked the stool again. "The way I've been feeling for years now, all thanks to him." "And how's that?" "Helpless," he muttered, hating having to do so, even though it was only to Rex. 3 years ago, his brother was a senior about to graduate from university. The Shepherds had just made some money and were starting to establish themselves in the city, and Aneski had started his first year here at Guest Fine Arts. He'd been in his final class of the day when the rumors going around campus had finally reached him. That was how he'd found out about the fight at the mall and the resulting fire. About how at least 3 people had been rushed to the hospital, and about how 1 was still missing on the scene. Russ's body had never been recovered, but the firefighters working the case had found bone fragments, and all of the witnesses who'd come forward had assured them Russ was the only one left inside that particular room where the fire had started. It had to be him. Just like that, Aneski lost the only surviving family he had left. It's been horrible, but tolerable only because he'd had faith that Flix would be there for him to lean on. But Flix had used him once and discarded him without a second glance. He turned his back on Ani as though all the time they'd spent together had been nothing. As though he were nothing. Then he's been well and truly alone. Again. His friends had tried their best, they really had. Rexton and Gannon especially. But it hadn't been the same. Hadn't been enough. What Aneski had needed, who he had needed, had vanished from his life just as rapidly as his brother had. He would never forgive him for that. But Rex didn't need to know the extent of Aneski's fury, not where that was concerned. How would he explain it anyway? Already his friend was suspecting he was too invested, that this had less to do with finding answers and more to do with punishing the man who'd chosen to abandon him. He wasn't wrong. That was what it was about. Whether they got answers or not, Russ was gone. He died, and that was that. Flix, though? Flix was still here, breathing and walking around like nothing had happened. Like he'd forgotten. If it was the last thing he did, Aneski was going to make him remember. It wasn't fair that he was the only one in pain, that he was the only one alone, that he was the only one waking up with stained boxers after another aggressive, wet dream. It wasn't fair that he'd been reduced to this, the sicko who still lusted after his brother's potential murderer. He knows something, he said. Flix has to. About what? The fire itself? It was abnormal, Aneski insisted. Hot enough to practically eviscerate the body in less than an hour. Normal fire doesn't do that. The bones hadn't just been charred or slightly burnt. It'd been like someone had run them through a crematorium. Rex blew out a breath, unable to argue there. Aside from that one person who told you they'd seen him there, there's no other proof. Are you absolutely... I'm certain, he interrupted. You really think I'd go through all of this if I wasn't? Honestly? Yeah. Yeah, I do. Grief messes with people, makes them do strange things, illogical things. Like kidnap the runner of the most influential mafia in the galaxy? Rex laughed. Exactly like that. I know it's crazy, he confessed. And I know I'm putting my life on the line, that I dragged you into it and made you do the same. But I need this. I need to have done something. For 3 years, all he'd managed to accomplish was rising the ranks of the shepherds. This is all I have left. We've already taken back your brother's gang, Aneski. It isn't enough. That was only step one. He'd meant to punish Haroon and reclaim what his brother had helped to build. But Haroon wasn't the only thing Aneski had lost the day his brother had died. This mission is most likely going to get us both killed. Rexton set his hands on his hips. But I'm with you all the way. Thanks. Whatever. He waved him off. That's what friends are for. What are friends for? Cage's airy voice had them turning toward the door just as he and another of their group, Bridger, entered. He was carrying a storage tube which he set down on one of the empty tables. Told you they'd be in here chatting. Bridger glanced between the two of them but replied to the brunette with a bored, unsurprisingly. There were 5 of them in total, all members of the Shepherds, brought in at different intervals. Aneski and Cage both had older siblings enter. Rexton and Gannon had followed Aneski once he'd made it known what he intended to do in the long run. They were the only 2 who knew about his real plans, the only ones who were aware he had absolutely no true interest in running a gang. The last of them, Bridger Boaz, was relatively new, having joined 2 years ago, but he was loyal and they'd all instantly connected with him. When Flix hadn't woken up within the first 24 hours after his kidnap, Aneski had panicked a little and called in Bridge to check on him. He was a medical student and had obviously recognized the Brummel member, so he'd been read in. Sort of. Aneski had only given him the basics, and Bridger had actually been the one to tell him to keep the rest to himself. Because smart people didn't involve themselves with anything that went against the Brummel. Gan didn't come with you? Rex asked Bridger, noting his absence. He wasn't by the car when I left, Bridger said. Both he and Gannon attended Vail University, while the rest of them were guest students. Maybe his class ran late. You didn't bother to check? Cage let out a low whistle. Cold, man. Practical, he corrected. Anyway, Cage leaped up onto the table, dangling his legs absently. You guys headed to the house? The Shepherds used a residential home that had once belonged to a sweet older lady. Since taking over, Aneski had tried to return it to her grandson, but he turned the offer down and told him to keep it. Too many bad vibes attached or something like that. Since he didn't exactly have a replacement home base on hand, Aneski had gratefully accepted. Instead of dorming on campus, he and his friends shared rooms at the house, with the basement converted to hold official Shepherd meetings. He'd weeded out the bad seeds from the start, so now the open door policy for the rest of the members didn't give him the ick like it had when his predecessor Harun had been in charge. I've got somewhere else to be, Aneski said, ignoring the knowing look Cage sent his way. Ah, that time already? Russ had left him enough coin to get by for the first year, but after that, Ani had to get creative. Becoming a porn star, even with a concealed identity, had seemed like a good idea at the time. The Bind movies were some of the most popular films watched on the entire planet, and the mask he always wore while filming allowed him the anonymity Aneski needed to feel comfortable releasing them. But, of course, a mask could only hide so much, and those closest to him had easily picked up on his identity. Shut up. He regretted admitting that he was the one in the films when his friend had approached him, but it wasn't like he would have gotten away with the lie. Cage came off like the type of person lost in his own little world, but in reality he was insanely perceptive. He'd only gotten 15 minutes through the first Bind film before he'd called Aneski while in the theater and asked point blank if he was the redhead. What? Cage grinned. You know I love your work. Bridger cleared his throat and glared at Cage. You will not be watching this one. Why not? Rexton rolled his eyes and turned to Aneski. When do you have to leave? Filming starts in an hour. He had enough time to finish his sculpture before he had to head. His multi-slate dinged. Use. Sorry, something came up with Saint. I won't be able to make it tonight, Red. Ani read the message twice and groaned. Why was everything going to shit for him lately? The first film had been a desperate money grab so he could afford all his supplies for school, but Bind had been incredibly popular, placing #1 at the Seaside Cinema for over a month. He'd taken the second film a bit more seriously, screening potential partners this time around. They both wore masks in the films, and their real names were never mentioned in the credits, which helped protect their identities. That also meant more people who might not have been open to being a part of a pornographic film submitted interviews. Aneski wasn't a big fan of random hookups, but he didn't have the time for a relationship, and his tastes were specific. Hughes Quint, Cage's cousin, had been the best fit out of all of them, which was how he'd ended up partnering with Aneski for the last two. He'd rented out the space already, which wasn't cheap, and had already discussed the release date with Seaside. They couldn't miss this deadline. His original partner was no longer around, and he hadn't kept the contact info of any of the other people who'd interviewed last year when he'd been looking. Since they only got together and filmed a video once every 6 months, Aneski hadn't thought to bother. Fuck. There weren't any blondes he personally knew who he'd be comfortable. He paused, already knowing the idea of formulating in his mind was a bad one. Like, really, really bad. Rex had been right earlier, though, when he'd accused him of chasing after some twisted teenage fantasy. Since the moment he was introduced to flicks at the age of 16, the Brummel member had starred in every single one of Aneski's most graphic wet dreams. Hell, it was all thanks to flicks that Aneski had discovered what he was actually into, that he liked being tied up and taken advantage of. That he wanted to be both cared for and coveted. When he'd hired Hughes for the last film, they'd kept things simple. Just a bit of light bondage in a carefully lit room to give off a sensual vibe. Tonight's film was meant to be a bit more elaborate, with the two of them delving more deeply into the art form of kinbaku. Considering their stance, there was no way Aneski was going to be able to make flicks participate in something as complex as that, but Harun had been into some fucked up shit. When Aneski had moved into his office at the house, he'd found a stash of pills he'd later identified as roofies. At the time, he thought it disgusting, but in light of his current situation, Flix was too dangerous to even consider fucking at the moment, but if he was given one of those pills, he might become desperate enough Aneski could use him to put on a show. It might even help be the extra push the Brumal member needed in order to cave and finally confess what he knew. A part of him felt horrible that he still craved a taste of Flix, even after everything. He'd spent nights lying awake, bitter and hating himself for it even. Taking advantage of him the way he had so far had done very little to soothe the anguish in his gut. Maybe this was what he needed. Even if that meant he was just as big a monster as the one he'd hunted and chained. I've got to go. Forgetting all about the statue, Aneski headed for the door, only recalling he needed to warn Rexton just as he was about to pass beneath the threshold. I won't need you later, by the way. Rex frowned. You sure? Was he? Not really. If his best friend knew the type of risk he was about to take, he'd be livid. What was one more stupid thing added to the long list of dumb decisions he'd recently made, though? Yeah, Aneski gave him a reassuring smile. I'm sure. Tonight, he'd finally fulfill those teenage daydreams. Or he'd get murdered trying. Chapter 4. The blindfold prevented him from seeing anything, but Flix could hear the sounds of footsteps, light as they circled him. He stilled, tipping his head in their direction, feeling the cool air trail around him from the movement, licking at his flesh. His bare, naked flesh. It was starting to feel normal, though. He couldn't recall the last time he'd been allowed clothes. Operating off the assumption that the beginning of the process started during the morning hours, that's when Popcorn filled his room with gas and then snuck in to undo all of the fancy locking mechanisms around Flix. He'd be long gone before Flix woke, but he wasn't too mad about that since it gave him privacy to piss and shower off the torture from the day before. Cum, sweat, and sometimes a little bit of blood. They were honestly so bad at this whole thing, it was almost laughable. Would have been for sure, if not for Flix's internal clock ticking down. He could already feel his power starting to flood his system, his skin a bit too tight. It made him antsy, which could easily be misinterpreted by his captors as him starting to be worn down. There was usually a bowl filled with shitty-tasting, overly salty soup broth, but he had to remember to eat it before entering the bathroom, because as soon as Flix stepped out of the tiny shower stall, more gas was filtered into the rooms. The next time he woke, he was usually on the floor in some other position, one that exposed his bits and the things being done to him down there. After he was screwed, there was gas again. Back on the wall. Interrogation Part 2. Bedtime. Repeat. The questioning during the interrogations that took place were always the same, but Flix refused to answer. If they'd cut him, beat him, hell, even shot at him, they could have wrapped this whole kidnapping scheme up within a week tops. But no, they had to go and shove a dildo up his ass. That was one of 3 reasons Flix was dragging this out. 1, they'd purposely tried to humiliate him. Not that it worked, because honestly, what did taking cock have to do with anything? Flix was a badass whether he was a taker or a giver. 2, they'd use only metal bindings, which led him to believe they knew something more about him than the rest of the planet. Something they sure as hell shouldn't. Something he'd have to kill them for knowing. 3, he recognized one of them, and knowing that person's identity meant he could never tell. The sound of steps came to a stop, and with the gag over his mouth, Flix was forced to wait for his visitor to speak. Constantly taking in the gas had left him groggy, and sometimes it was harder for him to focus than others. Right now, it felt early, like he'd been woken too soon by the presence, but there was no way to know for certain if that was actually true. A moment later, the person drew nearer, and Flix frowned when he caught a whiff of an unfamiliar scent. This wasn't Popcorn or his captor. Flix made himself remain still, feigning unconsciousness since that was his only defense, bound to the wall with metal like he was. He was actually grateful for the gag and blindfold now, since it helped keep him from giving himself away earlier, though he supposed at least then he could have gotten a look at this new arrival. Were they here to kill him? Torture him properly? The tense moment dragged on, and then the footsteps retreated, and the door eased shut with a subtle click. Well, that had been odd. Was Aneski getting bored and bringing someone else into this? Maybe he'd wised up, and whoever that person had been just now, they'd come to get a feel for the situation before coming up with a torture plan that might actually work. As if conjured by his thoughts, the door was tossed open again, the sound of the steps different than the previous person's, more familiar now that Flix knew to listen for it. It made absolutely no sense, but some of the tension in his shoulders eased. Ridiculous, considering the man who'd just entered was the whole reason Flix was here. The distinct scent of clay and sour-sweet apple reached his nose. The upside to not being able to see all this time was the way his other senses had heightened to make up the difference. He could catch that familiar scent right away. It helped that it hadn't changed much in the 3 years since they had last been in a room alone together. Well, in a room consensually, in any case. The smell and the line of questions were dead giveaways, and yet the man approaching him still tried his darndest not to reveal who he was. It was so stupid it was almost cute. The gag was dragged down, and then the press of a water bottle was brought to his cracked lips. Flix chugged, not about to miss this opportunity, growling even when it was forced away before he'd had his fill. He waited for the gag to be replaced, but nothing else happened. Even though the man hadn't left him yet, silence stretched between them. To what do I owe the visit? Flix opted to speak first, his voice crackly and raw from a mixture of misuse and all the huffing and heaving he did whenever he was left with a thrusting toy for hours on end. Don't tell me you missed me. If he had, doing all of this was kind of a weird way of showing it. Flix wasn't actually that naive, though. He knew the other man hadn't missed him. Once all of this was settled and done, he'd deal with the way that cut on a different level. By all means, he continued when the other man didn't reply. Don't leave me hanging. He tugged at his wrists, which were chained to the wall over his head, and laughed bitterly at his dumb joke. Pretty cavalier for someone who's totally fucked like you are, a warm voice finally said. It changed over 3 years, grown and hardened, but notes of it were still familiar enough that hearing it always had Flix's heart skipping a beat before his mind reminded it to calm the hell down. Not being fucked at the moment, he pointed out, but I'm sure it's coming. It's been 3 weeks already. He sounded tired, more so than Flix, ironically. Just answer the questions. Nah. If his neck hadn't been secured to the wall already, he would have made a big show of leaning back just to irk his interrogator. You really want to keep doing this? It's not that, Flix admitted. I'm just better at the long game than you. Don't take it personally. I'm better at it than everyone. So you fully intend to take what you know about Russ to the grave, is that what you're saying? He demanded. Flix sighed and went quiet. Answer me! A palm slapped against the wall at the side of Flix's head, but he didn't flinch. Damn it! The man spun away and cursed. Flix waited for him to collect his thoughts, prepared for the next threat when it was finally delivered. I filmed it all, you know. He sort of had an inkling, but Flix kept that to himself. What if I leaked the footage? How scared do you think the rest of the world would still be if they saw the things I did to that sweet ass of yours? He smirked. I don't think that's as menacing as you mean for it to be. No? No. Should I call your bluff? By all means, Flix said. Leak it. Not only will it not embarrass me, but you'll also be doing me a favor by alerting the Brumo about what's truly going on. Have you heard of my bestie Berga? Love that guy. No matter how tight your security here is, he'll find me within 24 hours of that video getting out. And then, you and I will be having a different kind of fun. The burn mark on his ass from a couple of weeks ago still pissed him off when he thought about it. He'd for sure be returning that favor, along with a few others. You're right, the man agreed, which is why I've come up with a plan B. Flix admittedly wasn't a huge fan of the sound of that. You're a patron of the Seaside Cinema. It wasn't a question. Ever see any of the Bind films? His eyes widened some behind the blindfold, and he was grateful for it a second time. Of course he'd watched those films. They were some of the most popular in the city, even if they were relatively uncomplicated. Each film featured a masked redhead getting tied up and pounded by another masked man. The partner sometimes changed, but the redhead was a constant feature. And the whole reason Flix had bothered with the films at all. Not that he'd be sharing that detail. Hasn't everyone? He said instead, trying to sound unimpressed even though he was starting to feel a twist of excitement. My partner canceled on me, his captor drawled. So I've decided to use you. How's that sound? I get to leak a sex tape of you anyway, and without the risk of your dangerous friends discovering what's going on. Still think it's funny? I think it's adorable that you clearly believe you're going to get me to have sex with you, he replied. If I recall, typically in your films, you're the one who's tied up and taken, not the other way around. Going for a different vibe this film? There was a pause, maybe where his captor was trying to figure out how he knew, but he must have realized he'd given away more than enough clues for Flix to put 2 and 2 together. We both know that's why viewers keep coming back for more. They like to watch me moan. He hummed in agreement, because, yeah, guilty. Last chance, his captor said. Tell me what I want to know, or the next time you wake, you'll be hopped up on a strong enough aphrodisiac I won't have to do anything to get you to willingly fuck me on camera. He quirked a brow. You're going to drug me? That was the big play here? Actually, Flix scowled and forced himself to tense a bit to give off the impression he found that distasteful. You think drugging me will be enough? You make me horny, and I'm going to tear through that tight ass of yours to get what I want. Do you really want that to be captured on camera? If the idea of being used like that bothers you so much, answer my questions. I'm Brummel, he stated. I bow to no one. Suit yourself. The prick of a needle in his upper thigh had Flix actually sneering a moment before drowsiness started to set in. When you wake up, a warm gust of air fanned Flix's ears as his captor spoke. You'll be so out of your mind with lust, you'll forget all about even wanting to escape me. Promises, promises. Ignore him, it's just my kid brother. Russ led Flix through the small living room of his apartment and down a narrow hall, not even bothering to greet the smaller guy seated on the couch. He unabashedly stared as Flix passed, amber eyes widened slightly, lips parted. It was hard to tell if he was afraid or enthralled, but it didn't really matter one way or the other. I thought you said your brother was a child. Flix had been certain from the way Russ always spoke about Ineski that was the case. When they'd been younger, he'd only ever encountered Russ, and that was because they'd wait for the school bus together. Flix had only learned he even had a brother recently, when he and Russ met up again at Vale. He followed him into the first room on the right, entering Russ's bedroom and slowly shutting the door at his back so he could lean against it. He is, Russ replied as he moved about collecting things and shoving them into a black backpack. He's got to be a teenager, Flix snorted. He paused to consider it and then shrugged. He's 17 this year, I think. Or was it 15? Those are 2 very different numbers. Yeah, well, sue me. I don't remember if he was a year older than Mixie or a year younger. I'm a bit distracted with other things, man. Other things. Flix rolled his eyes. Mixie? Certainly not. Your dead dog? Hey, don't speak ill of her. She was the greatest. Whatever. Flix loved animals as much as the next person who had half a soul, but still. You can't remember your brother's age? Callous. Maybe you're cut out for this life after all. Shut up. Russ tossed a wadded t-shirt at Flix, laughing when it hit him in the face. His multi-slate dinged then, and he swore. Shit, it's Haroon. I've got to take this or he'll throw a tantrum. You know how he is. Unfortunately. If Flix had any say, he'd have nothing to do with the newly formed gang, the Shepherds. He was only involved because of his friendship with Russ, a friendship he was beginning to regret more and more with each passing day. Damn Mrs. Grady for seating them next to each other in kindergarten. It wasn't until then that they'd realized they even were on the same bus or lived in the same complex. I'm getting a drink. He excused himself, shutting the door with a little more force than necessary, mostly just for show. The idea of standing there, listening to Haroon whine was the least appealing thing he could think of. He'd hated the guy from the moment Russ had introduced them, but it wasn't like he had any right to tell his friend who he should and shouldn't hang around with. Then again, considering where they were now, he probably should have. The kid brother was still sitting on the couch when Flix entered the attached kitchen, and he nodded at him over the half wall before pulling open the fridge, only to find the damn thing empty. "How the hell do you two survive here without any food or water?" he growled. When there came no response, he glanced up, capturing the kid's gaze and quirking a brow. "Well?" Aneski noticeably gulped. We eat out a lot, or Russ brings home leftovers from the school cafeteria." Flix grimaced. "He brings you doggy bags from Vale?" Dude was really taking this whole dog reference too far if you asked Flix. Not that anyone had. He should cut his losses and leave, wait for Russ in the car, then grab something to eat on his way to Burgers later. But he took in the scrawny kid before him. "How old are you?" 16. Ah, so the same age as Mixie had been, actually. Berga was always telling him the friendly act he put on was far too over the top, that a Brummel member wouldn't be so carefree, that Flix should tone it back if he hoped to keep up the ruse and hide his real demons from the rest of the world. Surely he wouldn't want Flix leaving a kid here to starve, though, right? He blew out a breath and ran a hand through his hair. "You eat yet?" Aneski shook his head once as though afraid moving too much would set Flix off or something. "Come on." Flix motioned at him with 2 fingers and headed toward the door, snatching a card off the counter on his way. Not many people still use physical payment methods, most of them opting to scan their multi-slate instead, but Russ was a bit old school, and careless, considering he'd left the card laying around. Yanking open the door, he held it up to Aneski. "You ever steal your brother's card before?" Another shake of his head, though he didn't seem upset that Flix had done so. He chuckled and exited into the hallway, shoving his hands and the card into the pockets of his blue and yellow bomber jacket. The soft patter of footsteps followed closely after, and the corner of his mouth tipped up when he thought about how it looked like he'd picked up a stray. Now he was the one making pet references. Good light. The apartment complex wasn't expensive, so there wasn't an elevator even though they were on the 4th floor. Flix led them down the winding flights of stairs silently, giving the kid space to sort through his thoughts and potentially change his mind and turn tail and run. It wasn't often someone so eagerly followed after a devil of vitality. Flix would have pegged him for naive, only knowing he was Russ's brother meant that was most likely not the case. The two of them had been orphaned for almost 4 years now, forced to make ends meet on their own. "You a part of the Shepherds?" Flix spoke once they made it to the parking lot, clicking the button on his multi-slate to start the black vehicle up as they approached. "No way," Aneski said, and for the first time there was a bit of bite to his tone. Flix sent him a grin over his shoulder. "Not a fan of gangs?" "Not a fan of putting myself in unnecessary danger," he corrected, eyes gleaming slightly with barely contained annoyance. Sore subject, then. He must fight about this with Russ a lot. Flix pulled open the passenger side door and paused. "Do you know who I am, kid?" He straightened to his full height, which was adorably an entire foot shorter than Flix. "Of course I do. And I'm not a kid. We're basically the same age." He laughed before he could help it. "I'm almost 18, actually. Hung back a year in middle school for personal reasons. Reasons he wasn't about to get into with anyone. Only Berga and his parents knew the real truth, and it was going to stay that way." "Still," Aneski insisted, though his shoulders caved in some, "I'm not a kid." "Whatever you say, tiny terror." He motioned to the seat. "You coming or not?" "Where are we going?" "You're asking that now?" Flix cocked his head. "What, finally realizing walking off with the devil is akin to putting yourself in unnecessary danger?" With a huff, Aneski slid into the car and snapped the buckle into place. Then he turned and stared up at Flix, who was still standing there holding the door. Not all risks are the same, Fulmini. Flix laughed again and shut the door, sealing Aneski in. We'll see about that, he mumbled to himself as he rounded the vehicle. Chapter 5. Aneski checked the ropes for the 4th or 5th time as he waited for Flix to wake up. He'd crushed the pill already and mixed it with water, the empty glass on the end table next to the cream-colored couch he had Flix tied to. Getting the unconscious man to drink had been a struggle, but they'd managed, even though some of it had spilled. He'd situated the Brummel member in the center, with his legs spread wide and his ankles each attached to the front legs of the furniture. His wrists were bound with the same red rope and attached to a hook Aneski had installed beneath the cushions. It kept the metal out of sight, keeping things aesthetically pleasing for the viewers. That was also why he ditched the metal chains and gone with his traditional ropes instead. His gaze tracked down Flix's naked form, admiring both the man and his personal handiwork. The intricate knotwork had been meant for him, the plan being to dangle him from the large wooden beam at the ceiling and have Hughes take him that way. Since he couldn't trust Flix to roam free, he'd had to come up with a new plan on the fly. It'd also been too risky to move him to the original filming location, so they were making do at the hideout. There was a good chance his viewers wouldn't appreciate this movie as much as the last, but there was no way around it. He was going to have to be the one in charge and hope they thought of the change as a breath of fresh air instead of a mistake. He tied the rope around Flix's neck and across his chest, and aside from that, the two of them were only wearing masks. Half masks that matched, both white with gold trim. There were 3 cameras, one above them, one to the left, and another facing the couch. Aneski had already hit record, not knowing when Flix would wake. He figured he had to edit the footage before sending the final product off to the theater anyway. His entire being seemed to be humming in anticipation, and Aneski allowed his hand to trail down his stomach as he watched the slow rise and fall of Flix's chest. The second his fingers wrapped around his dick, he sighed, smearing a thick drop of pre-cum around his flushed crown, taking things slowly to amp up the torture. Because that's what he needed. He needed to remind himself why they were really here. It wasn't so he could finally get fucked by his first love. It was a punishment, one meant for the both of them. Only an ungrateful monster would covet his dead brother's ex. Aneski could still recall the awe he felt the first time Flix had walked through their front door. Recall the way his heart had picked up several beats and his skin had started to burn, not unlike how he was feeling right now. There was a magnetism to the Brummel member he'd never experienced with anyone else. He'd wanted him instantly. When he discovered his brother was dating the object of his desire months later, to say he'd been devastated would be an understatement. Aneski had holed up in his room and refused to come out. Russ had blamed it on a teenage temper tantrum, and he'd let him believe that. He'd never breathed a word of his obsession to anyone other than Rexton, who, at the time, had comforted him like a best friend should. Until he'd realized that Aneski's crush was more than that and borderline unhealthy. Maybe this was really what he needed to finally get the older man out of his system, once and for all. It was incredibly noticeable the second the drugs started to kick in. Little Flix woke before the rest of him, slowly rising to the occasion, and not little in any sense of the word. Aneski squeezed himself when an opaque drop beaded out of Flix's tip. The thought of all of that inside of him, Flix groaned and blinked, shaking his head as he lifted it from the back of the couch. "Rise and shine, Sleeping Beauty," Aneski taunted, grinning when Flix met his gaze. It was hard to tell with the mask, but he was pretty sure his captive was frowning. "What, don't remember what's going on?" He pursed his lips and tried to move, gritting his teeth when it hit him he was restrained. When he jerked his hips, his cock slapped against his abs and he paused. "Seriously?" "I warned you," Aneski said, with a single shoulder shrug, tipping his head to the left to indicate one of the cameras. He was still slowly pumping himself, and a fresh wave of lust washed over him when Flix's gaze lowered and landed on him there. Don't worry, pretty soon you won't be able to focus enough to think or complain. That's how this particular drug works. He'd have Flix desperate and needy for him, the same way he'd always been. The Brummel member gulped, and Aneski watched the movement of his throat muscles. If he wasn't afraid of being bitten, it'd be tempting to pull Flix's head down and force his mouth to take him. Just picturing it had Aneski moaning. Good light. His films tended to be just over an hour long, but he didn't know how he was going to last at this point. Maybe he'd have to film more later. The idea of this not being one round, but a couple. I need you inside of me, he announced, dropping to his knees, ignoring the way Flix tried to flinch back. Since he couldn't shove his dick inside the other man's mouth, Aneski's tongue flicked out, lapping at the engorged tip of Flix's cock. Don't you need that too? His head fell back when Aneski wrapped his lips around his crown and sucked. Stop, I can't. Focus? Aneski tissed. You don't have to. Just sit back and take it like a good boy, yeah? Flix's shoulders tensed at that, clearly annoyed. What did you just call me? What? He batted his lashes behind the mask in mock innocence and leaned back in, trailing the tip of his tongue on the underside of his cock. The salty flavor had him shifting closer and resting both hands on Flix's thighs. He nuzzled at him and then nipped at it, light enough so it wouldn't hurt. Flix growled in warning anyway. Do you even know who I am? Aneski asked, sliding one hand lower so he could cup Flix's heavy sack. Know who you're about to fuck? Do you? Flix's words slurred slightly and his pupils dilated. After tonight, I'll be your bed partner. That was all he needed to focus on at the moment. Forget the past and the future. Just concentrate on the present and the feel of Flix's burning cock against his tongue. The way the Brummel's thigh muscles strained and his breath hitched. The only other time they'd done this had been so different in comparison. Aneski hadn't had the chance to pay attention, to take it all in. He wasn't going to blow this opportunity for a redo. If you beg me to be nice to you, I can be, Aneski found himself saying, lapping at Flix's cock continuously, enjoying the warmth radiating off his body. You're going to regret this, Flix proclaimed, but Ani had heard enough of that already. Aneski took him in as far as he could go, groaning when his cockhead stretched his lips and bumped roughly against the back of his throat. The discomfort was part of the pleasure, and when Flix tossed his head back and gasped, that only spurred him on further. He'd been praised in the past for his skills, and putting on a good show was part of why he was doing this, but it wasn't the only reason. It wasn't long before the cameras and his original motive bled into the background, sucked up by the recesses of his mind. His own dick leaked between his legs, dripping all over the cement floors, the anticipation causing his entire body to feel like it was about to spontaneously combust. The anger was still there, bubbling just beneath the surface, as well as the hurt he'd carried these past few years, but at the moment, all Aneski could seem to care about was scratching the tormenting itch. He pulled off and climbed into Flix's lap hurriedly, sliding his palms over the toned planes of the older man's chest, feeling him up all over like a man possessed. Did you happen to accidentally drug yourself too? Flix asked, the comment meant as an insult. Aneski merely shook his head. This is just what you do to me. It's what you've always done. Don't be so dramatic. Aren't you even remotely ashamed of what you're doing? Why should I be? We're enemies and you're my kidnapper, he reminded, though when Aneski brought his mouth to his lips, Flix didn't resist. Instead, he leaned in to accept the kiss, licking forward to greet his tongue. They dueled for dominance, the Brummel all pent up, lust and rage to counter Aneski's greed and desperation. And he was desperate. He couldn't even muster up the embarrassment Flix was referring to. "I'm finally taking what I've always wanted," Aneski breathed against his skin before pulling away to trail open-mouth kisses down the expanse of Flix's neck. "Where's the shame in that?" "Right, because you're a shepherd," Flix drawled. "A thug. Stealing is your forte." "Who cares if I'm a shepherd and you're a Brummel?" he said. "We're both just flesh and bone at the end of the day. Both just..." He reached between them and grabbed onto Flix's hard member. "Slaves to sensation and desire." "Speak for yourself." "Don't deny it," he insisted, shifting onto his knees, planting one at either side of Flix's hips on the couch. Aneski tilted Flix's large cock, moving so his hole was angled and he could rub that silky wet crown against his entrance. "Stop," Flix demanded, surprising him when he added, "You'll hurt yourself." He chuckled. "I came prepared. Worked myself good and open to receive you quick. I'm no idiot. Even having given you 3 times the normal amount, there's no telling when the drug will wear off. Your hands have to stay bound, which means you can't exactly help me in that regard now, can you?" "So I'm just a cock to you then? That it?" Flix was angry, but the way his hips lifted off the couch in an attempt to enter Aneski gave away he was also too horny to try to put a stop to this. "A toy for you to ride and use and discard?" "And lick and suck and come all over," Aneski added, not feeling the least bit guilty about all of this. "You deserve it." He deserved worse, but this wasn't about him. This was about Aneski and finally putting an end to those childish fantasies floating around in his head, distracting him. "After this," he promised, the words spoken aloud as he wiggled that cockhead into himself, notching it in place, "I'll forget all about you. You'll mean nothing to me. No, less than nothing." Flix laughed, his head resting back on the couch, eyes narrowed but intensely gazing at him. "What's so funny?" "After this, I'm going to cut that pretty dick of yours off and feed it to your friend Popcorn," Flix stated. Aneski paused, the sting and slight burn of the stretch of his hole forgotten when a wave of worry rushed over him. "I won't give you the chance. Or maybe I'll just fuck you until you're a bleeding, sobbing mess, begging me to have mercy and slit your throat instead. How's that sound, Ani? To be fucked to death by me, to meet light, screaming my name. That's not... Wait, no." He searched Flix's eyes, praying he'd misheard, hopeful that maybe he really had when there was no immediate change in the older man. Then there was a crackling sound and a pop a second before Flix's arms came around him. He thrust upward, fully seating himself inside of Aneski's hole, hard enough Ani saw stars, and couldn't think to resist when he was lifted and slammed onto his back on the couch. One of Flix's hands went to his throat, pinning him down, while the other grabbed the underside of his left thigh and shoved his leg up. Aneski cried out as his body was forced into the strenuous position, his knee practically up by his shoulder. The shock waves radiating through him prevented him from thinking clearly, and before he realized he should be trying to get free, Flix started moving over him, rapidly battering his entrance with aggressive thrusts that shook the entire couch beneath them. He was torn between the stinging pleasure of being roughly taken and the horror of finding out Flix knew who he was. It was one thing to be called by his name, but the older man had gone straight for the jugular by referring to him as Ani. Something broke open inside of him and he snarled, finally lashing out, striking Flix across the face hard enough to crack the mask. One of the pieces cut into his cheek and a droplet of crimson splashed down onto Aneski's chin. Flix laughed, the sound dark and fairly manic, and despite the injury he didn't break rhythm, pummeling into Ani with seemingly all his strength. He winced and cried out and tore at Flix's sides with his nails, but the other man didn't let up. "To be clear," Flix said, practically breathing the words over top him, "this isn't because of the drug. I want you to know that, Ani. I want you to know that right now, You're being fucked like this as a punishment. Does it hurt? It should. No matter how well you thought you'd open yourself up for me, this should be painful for you. How? Aneski blinked against the tears that pooled in his eyes and clenched his jaw against the sharp stabbing sensation in his rear. Because Flix was right. It did hurt. Only his dick rubbed between them, slicking their skin with pre-cum, the friction keeping him caught in that blissful place where pain could actually fuel pleasure. My bestie is the butcher, Flix reminded. I'm immune to most drugs. You tricked me. I don't think you have the right to sound affronted. He moved his hand from his throat and twisted one of his nipples, chuckling when Ani sobbed. You don't have the right to this either. His palm moved down to tap at Ani's dick. With one swift move, he pulled out and flipped Aneski onto his stomach, lifting him onto his knees before he could get his bearings. His cock sought out his entrance again, finding it easily and pushed inside, rubbing against his already bruised flesh. Flix, you don't get to enjoy this, he growled, against the curve of his ear a second before his hand moved to the base of Aneski's dick and squeezed. Ani jerked in his hold, the tears flowing more freely now, but he couldn't get away, sucking in a breath when one of Flix's arms pressed against his throat next. I'm not letting you come, Flix said. I'm not even going to let you feel my cum inside of you. You'd like that too much, right? Feeling yourself filled with my spunk? He tightened his grip. Aneski's vision started to wink in and out, and he panicked, but Flix held firm. Sweet dreams, Ani, he whispered. Dreams? So he wasn't going to kill him? How absolutely fucked up that, even now, overpowered like this, about to be knocked unconscious, Aneski felt a trickle of relief. There was only one reason a man like Flix would allow him to walk away from this with his life. A part of him had to be stuck in the past, just like he was. A part of him, even a minuscule part, had to care. He clenched around that intruding cock and then passed out with the sound of Flix's moan in his ears. Chapter 6. Flix stared down at the unconscious and naked form at his feet for a moment, before bending to tear the stupid plastic mask off of Ani's face. He tossed it over his shoulder and removed the one he was still wearing with a sigh. Aneski Kendricks. Total pain in my ass, he muttered, then cocked his head. Literally now. It'd been a long time since the two of them had been alone and on good terms, but not that long since Flix had spotted him in the city, and on the guest campus, and walking into his house, a different home from the one he'd shared with his shithead brother Russ. Fucking Russ. Flix stood with a growl and ran his long fingers through his damp hair, finally taking in the 3 cameras all aimed his way. That wouldn't do. Not because he hated the idea of there being a sex tape of the two of them out there, but because they'd both said too much. As appealing as having a bunch of strangers get off to him pounding the tiny terror was, Flix couldn't risk exposing his identity. He'd have to destroy the footage. Better yet, burning this whole place to the ground would be better. Less of a risk to anyone being able to link him to this location. There was no telling how many DNA samples he'd left behind in the time he'd been kept here. And it was here. He could tell by the smell that it was the exact same location he'd been held in all these weeks, even if it was a different room. This area had been painted a stark white, with an added sunroof situated directly over the couch to provide natural lighting during day shoots. It was already early evening now, so the light was beginning to fade, casting a golden glow on top of everything, including the man at Flix's feet, where he'd dropped him on the cold, hard floor as soon as he'd finished. What am I going to do with you? He already knew the logical answer. Aneski had somehow gotten it into his head that Flix was responsible for Russ's death, and he'd already proven he was willing to take insane risks to teach him a lesson. Flix couldn't let him live. Something in his chest constricted and he scowled. Just because he secretly checked up on the younger man now and again didn't have to mean shit in the grand scheme of things. He felt badly that the kid had been left alone, that was all. Although, he wasn't exactly a kid anymore. Hadn't really been one when they'd met, though. His much smaller side and shy nature had made him seem that way. Even after learning they weren't too far apart in age, it's been impossible for Flix to shake the idea that he was much younger. That wasn't the case now. Aneski's dick was flaccid and on full display between his golden thighs. Even soft, he was in impressive size. The rest of him was toned, a far cry from the scrawny kid Flix had known. He must hit the gym regularly. The tiny terror had grown up, that was undeniable. He'd grown up and become a kidnapper. His methods had been sloppy though, amateur. Aside from the single burn mark on Flix's ass and the aches in his body from being tied up, he hadn't suffered any injuries. Even his hole had been prepared for the most part before receiving any of Aneski's toys. It was like he'd wanted to hurt Flix but hadn't been able to bring himself to do so, so instead he towed the line. Broken a ton of laws and accosted him repeatedly, but couldn't push himself to go any further. If their roles had been reversed, Flix would have started removing fingernails on day 2. By day 3, he would have made his way to teeth. Really, the only thing Ani had done right here was try to get to him psychologically, only he'd chosen the wrong avenue. So what if he'd been receptive to a hand on his cock or a plug in his hole? Bodies were designed that way. Maybe if he'd identified himself, Flix could believe Aneski thought it would be humiliating for him because of who he was, but he tried hard to conceal it from him. Even that had been sloppy, but the effort had been there. "This is just a testament to why your gang will never be a real threat," he stated, setting his hands on his hips. The Shepherds had gone from having a crazy person for their leader to an obsessed one. Because this was an obsession. Aneski had obviously planned on asking Flix about his brother for a long time now. The real question was what had changed in his life to make him choose now of all times to act. "Did you need control first?" he wondered aloud. "Funding?" He glanced around at the building. A location? Ani and Russ shared the same father but different mothers, though neither had come from money. They'd grown up all right up until their dad had died working construction in a freak accident. After that, things had swiftly gone downhill. That was the major reason Russ had been convinced by his friend Haroon to help form the Shepherds in the first place, despite all of Flix's warnings against it. Should he have let Russ into the Brummel after all? What if... He cut those thoughts short, refusing to tumble down that rabbit hole. The past was the past and there was no changing it. Just like there was no changing what had been done to him here. The pattern had been clever, a way to break him down mentally and get his anxiety going, so he'd give Ani that. But feeding him and allowing him to bathe regularly? Mistakes. Taking him out like he was a toy in a shiny box? Big mistake. If you'd left me in the metal, you wouldn't be unconscious right now. It was a pity to have to kill him, but Flix couldn't allow anything like this to happen again. And if he didn't retaliate now, the second Burga discovered what had happened, Aneski's end would be 10 times worse than anything Flix could do to him. Only, this was Ani. Anyone else pulled this stunt and there'd be no hesitation, but Ani... Frustrated, he left the unconscious man there and went off in search of clothing. The white room was empty, aside from the couch, with 3 different exits. One was a long hallway behind the couch, but Flix went for the door to the right first. It opened to a smaller version, this one square-shaped with an opening leading to a bathroom that was little more than a sink, toilet, and a hose to shower quickly. He recognized it. The chains still attached to the wall helped solidify his assumptions. This was the room he'd been kept in. He slammed the door shut with a growl and crossed the room to the opposite one, tossing that open and walking through, only coming to an abrupt stop once he realized what it was. An art studio. Really? He glanced over his shoulder and clicked his tongue at Aneski. The room was about the same size as the one with the couch, only with pillar displays set about. Most of them already had a piece of work displayed on top of them, various sculptures, some complete, others in progress or left unfinished. Flix made his way through the row nearest him, only mildly interested in them as he searched for an apron or literally anything to cover himself with. There was an attached bathroom here as well, though one much nicer than the tiny box they'd made him use all this time. A set of clothes had been left on the sink, perhaps what Aneski had been wearing when he'd arrived or something he'd been planning to change into afterward. Flix frowned when he started pulling the black pants on and noticed the pin attached to the belt loop. The veiled university crest had to be worn by students whenever they were on campus. The accompanying shirt was also black, the color for seniors, which Aneski was, but what's a guest student doing with this? Or, better question, who'd given them to him? Did Aneski have friends at Vale? It wasn't unheard of, but it also didn't sit right with Flix for unknown reasons. Reasons he didn't have the time for. He made his way back into the studio and checked out the long row of windows set against the right wall. It was starting to get darker out, but he could see they were surrounded by trees. A hoverbike was parked on a patch of gravel, but that was the only vehicle in sight. There was no telling how long it would be until Popcorn made an appearance, which meant he needed to do some quick thinking. Burning the entire place to the ground really was the best plan. Just start a fire and get the hell out. Leave it all behind and figure out Popcorn's identity later. As for Aneski, he'd either wake before the smoke inhalation got to him or... Flix pursed his lips, not liking how his chest ached slightly. He didn't owe him anything, though, especially not after all of this. You didn't just get to mess with a Brummel member and walk away either. Him having to pay with his life? Fair trade. There were also his earlier thoughts about Berga to consider, because he hadn't been exaggerating. He went back to the White Room, eyes dropping back to Ani. They weren't actually that many years apart in age, but when they'd met, Aneski had looked even younger and had been half the size he was now. Russ had pretty much been an absentee parent toward him, more than a brother. Always out working or fooling around with that idiot Haroon. When things had ended and Ani had been left on his own, it'd been Flix who'd purchased the apartment in Russ's name so he wouldn't have to worry about moving. Flix, who filled a bank account for Aneski with enough money to keep him comfortable through the next 3 years of schooling at Guest. He'd done all of that, and for what? To be hated and blamed in the end anyway? Was it really all that important that Aneski didn't have the details about his brother's disappearance? Was it really worth doing all of this? Flix hadn't realized just how pissed off Ani truly was. How pissed he'd apparently been these past 3 years, holding this grudge against him as though he'd had anything to do with Russ's stupid decisions. He'd always been hot-headed and rash, and despite the sexual nature of the torture, Flix could probably forgive him for this whole debacle, eventually. There was really only one reason he'd need to kill Aneski, and since the guy had changed the ropes at the final stretch, it was clear Flix's concerns were there for naught. The metal chains he'd put him in must have been a fluke. If Aneski had known Flix's secret, he never would have switched to rope, especially not during sex, when he'd be at his most vulnerable. Aneski didn't know shit, which meant Flix didn't have to kill him. Screw it. Flix walked up to the first camera and snapped his fingers, a tiny blue spark forming between the two. When he held his hand up to the device, it shot forward like a miniature bolt of lightning, destroying it with one zap and a single puff of smoke. Shout powers. His greatest secret. And also the thing that would have killed him if Ani hadn't messed up now and given him the opportunity to escape. Getting to leech a little felt good, and he made quick work of the other two and then came back around, stopping at Aneski one last time as he pondered his next move. Leaving him lying there wouldn't do. He'd need a big enough head start, and there was no way to guess when Aneski might wake. Flix's gaze shifted toward the door to the room he'd been kept in, and he grinned at the picture forming in his mind. When he stooped and grabbed onto Aneski's ankle, dragging him carelessly across the smooth concrete floor, he felt a genuine twist of excitement. All this time of him carefully avoiding Aneski, only watching from the sidelines, sure not to get caught. He'd been doing him a favor by keeping his distance. Had been trying not to get him tangled up in Brummel bullshit. But if this was the way he was going to be repaid, he might not be willing to take Aneski's life. But Flix was going to take everything else. Payback is a devil, Ani. Chapter 7. Where are you now? Burga Obsidian's voice flowed through the earpiece in Flix's right ear as he exited his hover car and paused to take in the front entrance of the Guest Fine Arts Academy. He ditched the Vale University uniform he'd borrowed from Aneski days ago and had opted for a more discreet look. Not that it seemed to be working if all of the glances he was already getting just from standing in the parking lot meant anything. His all-black ensemble matched the dark lenses of his shades, so the attention could just be because he was fine as hell. Or everyone recognized him. Probably that one. Vacation, he said to his best friend, finally getting back into motion and heading for the wide sandstone steps that led from the parking lot up toward the main building. There was a moment of contemplation, and then, "That is a lie," he grunted. "If you knew that, why didn't you come looking for me, Are you okay?" Burga clicked his tongue. "Don't answer that. Obviously, since you answered my call, you are." "Had to get a new multi-slate," he said, another thing Ani owed him. "Someone spotted you in the city an hour ago." Burga didn't sound pleased. "How long have you been back?" "Around 3 days." Flix had ordered food to his house and stayed in all that time, partially to lick his wounds, but mostly because he'd been certain Aneski would come for him in a fit of stupidity and rage. He'd strung him up all pretty for popcorn to find and had been positive that would be enough to ignite the tiny terror's bad temper. Apparently, he'd missed his mark. Oh well, wouldn't happen again. The fact that Ani was making Flix come for him, another thing added to the list. "Who do I need to liquefy?" Burga's tone darkened, and Flix grimaced. He made it to the top of the stairs and ignored everyone hanging out on the grass, heading straight for the large archway leading into the first 3-story tall building. No one. "You were injured." Nothing got past Burga, but still. "Barely," he replied dryly. "Seriously, it was honestly pathetic. The only reason I needed to hole up for a bit once I got away was..." He let the sentence drag, not willing to risk speaking about his shout powers out loud. Burga caught on like he knew he would. "Leeching took that long? Were you on a vacation at all, for any amount of time you were gone?" "I wish." "I apologize. I should have been more suspicious when Michael told us. You would never leave without telling me." "It's fine," Flix reassured. "I'm fine." Given another few days, and he wouldn't have been, though. He'd hot-wired Ani's hoverbike and driven it down the narrow and winding path toward the city, shooting as much electricity off the tips of his fingers as he could on the way, confident there wasn't anyone chilling in the middle of nowhere who could see. Halfway home, he'd realized it wasn't going to be nearly enough, and he'd made the decision to pull over and go deeper. "There was news of a forest fire," Burga said. "I knew it was you." "I hope you didn't bother going to check." When he was met with silence, Flix sighed. "Sorry I didn't call sooner. I was worried. Everything is under control. If you're leaving me out of whatever revenge scheme you've cooked up," Burga stated, "then no, it isn't. You aren't. Relax. I'm not pissed off because I'm a shell." He was pissed because he was no longer an anal virgin, but he wasn't going to say that to his friend. "And I'm not about to do anything rash. I got this." Shouts had bad tempers, but only because of their powers. It built up within them if they didn't leech often enough. That specific personality trait wouldn't show in members of his kind that were powerless, however, like his parents. Like everyone else assumed he was. That's why it was so important to maintain his charismatic, give-no-shits composure. But this was different. Flix wasn't out for blood. He was out for Ani. "They managed to get the upper hand on you once," Burga reminded. "Only because I didn't know to look for them," he said. "This time, I'm the one on the hunt." Someone said Burga's name in the distance, voice sleepy. "Are you not alone?" Flix asked. "Call me if you need me," Burga said instead of answering. He hung up without a proper goodbye almost as soon as the words were out of his mouth. Flix let out a low whistle and grinned as he pulled out the earpiece and snapped it back into place in the side of his multi-slate, a square-shaped body-worn device worn over the wrist. Leave it to his bestie to find himself someone while Flix was being contained and tortured. He slid his hands into his pockets and stopped in the center of the main building. The floor beneath him was tiled in whites and reds, the rings reminding him of a bullseye. There was a large dome ceiling above, 3 different directions he could take, and 3 levels. While he'd tracked Ani on his way to campus before, Flix had never actually entered, having no real reason to. "Hey," he called out to the first student to pass by too closely, a female who clutched her art bag a little tighter, but then tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her hair coquettishly. He flashed her a flirtatious smile. "Any chance you know where I could find Ani Kendricks?" Her brow furrowed slightly. "Ani?" "Oh, sorry," he laughed, as though it'd been a mistake, even though it hadn't been. "Aneski." "Sure, you must be a friend of his." She pointed to the left where the building attached to another through a glass tunnel. "He's usually in Studio B. Is he not checking his multi-slate again?" "Something like that." He forced out a laugh. "Has he left you on red before, too?" "He's like that whenever he gets lost in a piece." She returned his sentiment and giggled. "The sky could probably fall down around him and he wouldn't notice." "Yeah." Flix took a step in the direction she'd indicated, then paused again, as though as an afterthought. "What was your name?" "Samara." "Nice to meet you," he said. "Thanks for the info." "No problem." She gave him a little wave and he nodded and walked off before she grew bolder and asked for his number. Flix's interest only stretched as far as knowing what her deal with Ani was and why. It didn't take him too long to find Studio B, and he didn't need to ask anyone else for help along the way. He was a bit worried when he finally came to the closed door to the room that someone would have tipped the tiny terror off, since he'd been clearly recognized by most of the students and staff he passed. When he twisted the knob and eased the door open, however, it was to find Ani alone. Aneski was bent over a podium that held an unfinished bust on it, his concentration so fully on his work that he didn't notice as Flix entered and closed the door quietly at his back. He held a sculpting tool in one hand and was using the other to smooth over edges here and there, his full lips pursed in a partial pout. Flix took a moment to enjoy the view. When he'd been captured, most of his time had been spent with that damn blindfold over his eyes, and he hadn't gotten the chance to. He told himself he'd just take a taste. That was it. He'd give himself that much in exchange for the past 3 weeks, then he'd call it even and let the tiny terror go. If he kept it simple, perhaps he'd even be satisfied with tonight and could end it there. Start tomorrow with a clean slate and put all of this behind them. Go back to watching from afar. You've grown up, Ani. He kept his voice low and silky, drawing out the statement like a lover might, letting all the appreciation drip like honey from his tongue. Aneski jolted, nicking his statue with the tool so a slice came out of its clay cheek, not that he seemed to notice. His eyes widened on Flix, and he straightened but smartly didn't make any moves to flee. Why so surprised? Flix took a lazy step away from the door. You should have been expecting me. He cocked his head, gaze hardening some when he quipped. I've been waiting for you. Ani didn't say anything, so Flix continued. I don't like that you've made me come all the way here to retrieve you. He kept walking forward as though they had all the time in the world, and with each step closer, his heart spiked a little more, the anticipation raw and all-consuming. The very first thing you should have done once Popcorn came and set you free was come find me and beg for forgiveness. Aneski swallowed and lowered his arms, still holding onto the sculpting tool. I'm going to need you to put that down, he warned. It was blunt enough, but didn't mean he couldn't take out an eye with it. And why should I give a shit about what you need? Ani finally replied, even though it was too obvious he was nervous, despite the fact he was trying his best to hide that fact. You know why I'm here, Flix said, coming to a stop less than 5 feet away. That should be reason enough. Don't make things harder for yourself, Tiny Terror. You've already pushed me past my breaking point. Aneski hesitated and then placed the tool on the edge of the pedestal. Is that why you left the note? Flix had found a piece of scrap paper and written a message across it hastily before sticking it to Oneski's chest. It'd been fairly simple. Come find me when you're less tied up. F. He chuckled. What? Didn't you find it funny? There was a pregnant pause, and then Flix found himself asking, Well, why didn't you come? I knew you'd find me yourself, Ani replied softly. Only a moron would enter a lion's den willingly. Only a moron thinks to kidnap a devil of vitality and get away with it unscathed, he countered. Oneski shook his head. I never assumed I'd get away with it. No? Why'd you do it then? You know why. Flix chuckled humorlessly. Apparently we both know a lot of things. Apparently. So, tell me then. He pulled his hands out of his front pants pockets. Know what's going to happen next? Well, he made a big show of dropping his gaze to Flix's palms. You're not holding a blaster, so I guess you're not here to shoot me outright. Where would the fun be in that? He hummed in what seemed like agreement before he said, I was afraid you would think that way. Were you hoping I'd be satisfied with how I left you waiting for your friend? It was pretty akin to an eye for an eye. Hardly. You locked me up for weeks. How long were you waiting there to be found? Ani gulped again. Around 5 hours. Flix snorted. And you thought that would be enough punishment to make us even? You seemed pretty interested in ignoring my existence before. There was a hint of attitude in his tone this time, and he caught himself and shifted on his feet. Oneski had always been like this, snappy and too careless with his words once he got comfortable around someone. It used to get him into trouble with his brother's friends, but in the past, Flix would always let it slide. Too bad for him, they were no longer living the good old days. You should have left well enough alone, Flix said. I should have been satisfied with you pretending we've never met. Something sharp uncoiled inside of him, and Flix tipped his head. Were you after my attention, Ani? That it? I want answers, he snapped. Tell me what happened between you and my brother. No. Why not? That's not why I'm here. I didn't come to talk about Russ. I came because you made me. Literally. Flix waited until it dawned on Ani what he meant. You'll pay for that as well. I wonder if you counted how many times you made me orgasm against my will. I didn't, he replied. But I'm sure you're going to give me the number. Nah, he grinned. Too easy. Oneski started to appear uneasy. What are you going to do, Flix? First, he took another step closer. Correct your manners. Call me Batessi. Like he used to, before everything had gone to shit. Flix had only ever allowed one person to refer to him as that. Anyone else who tried was immediately told Flix wasn't a born vital and didn't uphold those traditions. No fucking way, Ani practically growled. Flix clicked his tongue. It wasn't a request. If you're here to torture or kill me, then get on with it already. Either way, I'll never bow down to you. You want something from me? You're going to have to force... He chuckled, cutting Ani off. We aren't in the same league, Tiny Terror. I don't need to lower myself to your standards to get what I want. Force you? Like how? With chains and ropes and fucking toys that'll do all the work for me? I don't think so. Oneski bristled, but didn't reply. I'm going to have you on your knees begging for my forgiveness, he continued. And if you do a decent job of it, I might decide to punish you with my cock instead of my blade. Just stab me and be done with it. You're trembling, Flix noted. Are you scared? Or... He grinned. Dirty. You're turned on, aren't you? Picturing it right now? Picturing yourself on the ground with your lips wrapped around my cock? I'll bite it off, he threatened, though it fell flat. You'd never. You wanted to badly. Actually, maybe you're right. There was literally no chance in hell either of them would be walking away before Flix got a taste, but Ani didn't need to know that. Maybe giving you my cock wouldn't be a true punishment. Maybe he slid a step backward. I should turn back the clock. Ignore you like I've been doing. Aneski moved after him, catching himself before he could make it more than a foot forward. The way his cheeks stained pink in embarrassment and self-loathing was kind of cute. Since he'd struck a nerve, Flix intended to keep this ruse going for a bit, but the sound of voices outside the closed door dashed those plans in an instant. He shot forward before Ani had a chance to catch on that in seconds they would no longer be alone, snatching up the sculpting tool and capturing Aneski all at once. He twisted behind him and pressed the blunt tip of the blade against Ani's back. They both knew he couldn't do much damage with it, but it was more the meaning behind it anyway that counted. Flix draped an arm around him, settling himself behind Ani, and had just dropped his chin to his shoulder when the door opened and two male students came into view. They paused the second their eyes landed on Ani and him, and the corner of Flix's mouth turned up. He pressed the tool harder against Aneski's back, feeling him wince, and then greeted. "By all means, welcome to the party. Come inside, I don't bite." "Let him go," one of the guys said, worried painted across his face. He had thick, dark brown hair and purple eyes that would have been pretty if he weren't setting them on Ani longer than Flix was happy about. The other one, obviously both friends of the man in his hold, remained silent, but moved closer into the room along with the first. "We're just playing," Flix began, stopping when they got close enough he could smell them. He made a big show of sniffing the air, ignoring the way they both frowned at him. "Popcorn." It was unmistakable, and coming from the quiet one. Flix gave him a once-over, recognizing him as one of Aneski's longtime friends. "Rexton Cyphus. You were on my list of potential suspects, but I don't recall you smelling like this before. What changed? Your diet? Word of advice, you should lay off all that processed butter. It'll kill you." If he didn't do it first. It was obvious that's what he was getting at, but he left it to their imaginations to fill in the blanks. The color drained from Rexton's face. "This isn't about popcorn either." Flix turned against Ani's neck and whispered, "You're the one who brought him into this. Here's your chance to get him out." Aneski inhaled shakily. "Unscathed? So long as he doesn't try to stop us on the way," Flix promised. He could give up on his revenge against Rexton. If doing so meant using him as a stepping stone to what he really wanted, it'd be well worth it. "What do I have to do?" Flix smirked and planted a kiss against his carotid artery, chuckling when that caused the other man to shiver against him. "Come home with me, Tiny Terror. No chains, no ropes, just you on your own 2 feet." "What the hell are you saying to him?" Rexton found his voice. Irksome. Flix sent him a warning glare, but Ani beat him to the punchline. "Okay," he said. "I'll go with you." "What?" Rexton started for them, but the dark-haired one smartly stopped him, pulling him back. "Don't follow me," Aneski ordered, sounding more certain speaking with them than he had with Flix. "That's an order." "You can't." "I'll be fine." "Fuck!" Rexton swore and pulled himself free, but merely kicked at a stool. He didn't try approaching again. Flix laughed mockingly. "Good guess." The dark-haired one frowned, but Rexton's face flushed. Flix stepped out from behind Ani and grabbed him by the nape of the neck. Fucking is exactly what's on the agenda tonight. Aneski didn't struggle as Flix practically shoved him from the room, and his friends didn't attempt to help him. "You're a shit kidnapper," Flix drawled as they made their way down the hall. "But apparently your shepherds follow your orders. Good for you." "I don't need or want your praise," he growled. "You're a shit kidnapper," Flix repeated, bringing his mouth to the curve of Ani's ear. "But you're an even worse liar." Unfortunately for the both of them, Flix seemed to get off on that fact. Chapter 8. He was quiet the entire drive, like he'd been all that time he'd kept Flix chained up, His head turned stubbornly toward the passenger side window, glaring daggers out at the passing streets. The glares were just for show, Flix could tell. Ani was scared and trying to hide it. Good. Flix had known all about his involvement with the Shepherds, but he'd kept his distance anyway, figuring it wasn't his place anymore to order Aneski to quit. The hope had been eventually the younger guy would realize his mistake and grow out of it like his brother had. But no. Seemed like that was a lesson he was going to have to be taught by Flix after all. I put too much faith in you, he stated as he pulled them onto his street. Here I thought you'd be smart enough to keep yourself out of trouble. What, gonna spank me? Aneski challenged. I'm not your little brother. Stop treating me like I am. It'd been a long while since Flix had thought of him that way, but he kept that to himself, especially when his house came into view and a familiar car was parked in the driveway. Casimir Ambrose was propped up against the front door, typing away on his multi-slate without a care in the world. The cousin to their leader, and underboss of the mafia, Kaz had most likely been sent to check up on him. Flix parked the car and rested a hand over Aneski's wrist before he could make any motions to exit. Keep your mouth shut. Got it? Not a word, Ani. Don't. We're lucky that it's Kaz and not someone else. Someone more observant who might actually give a shit, he said. But that doesn't mean tipping him off won't be dangerous. I can't protect you from the underboss. Behave and do what I fucking tell you. Flix got out of the car and shut the door, not wanting to give Aneski the chance to argue further. Hopefully he got the message, because if not, Flix wasn't in a position to help him out if he got on Kaz's bad side. Not because he wasn't capable of holding his own against Casimir, but because he couldn't think of one good reason he should bother. Risk his life and career by attacking his friend for someone who just kidnapped and tortured him? Why? Yeah, no. That notion didn't help ease any of the tension he felt as he casually strolled down the stone path that connected the driveway to his 3-step porch. Kaz lifted his head after finishing off a message and gave Flix a solid once-over before straightening. You've dropped 7 pounds at least. Aren't vacations meant to be healthy? Okay, maybe he was more observant than Flix had given him credit for. He laughed like it was no big deal and bounded up the steps, making a big show of tossing his arms around Kaz in a sloppy hug that had him shoved back down the small flight within seconds. Flix tripped and landed on his feet, laughing. Seeing as how you're still a pain in the ass, Kaz drawled, I'm guessing it's safe to say I can give the all clear to Berga. He sent you? Of course he did. Flix should have known the call earlier wouldn't be enough to appease his best friend. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine. Yeah. Kaz's gaze trailed toward the path where Aneski was finally making his way toward them. That would probably be more convincing if you weren't coming home with a shepherd. Him? Flix shrugged. Michael ordered me to play nice, remember? What I remember is how reluctant you were about accepting that command. Aneski was close enough to catch that, and his eyes narrowed slightly, though he kept his mouth shut. Change of tune. Flix needed to make the underboss leave. I'll stop by tomorrow and catch up on everything I missed. You can tell Bergen not to worry so much, but, he ran a hand through his hair boyishly. Do me a favor and keep my company to yourself. You don't want Bergen knowing you're hanging out with him? Kaz chucked his chin toward Aneski, but before Flix could answer, his device dinged, and after reading whatever message he'd received, his attention clearly shifted. Whatever, it's none of my business anyway. Just be sure to stop by the manor. Everything always falls to shit when you're not around. Aw, did you miss me? He teased. Get wrecked. Kaz didn't so much as glance his way as he shot off another message and pushed past Aneski, forcing the other guy to step out of his way or risk getting bulldozed over. As an afterthought, he lifted a hand in a parting wave and then climbed into his car and sped off. Part of Flix was curious what had him in such a rush, but since he hadn't been asked to tag along, it must not be anything imperative or having to do with the Brummel. Why don't you want Berga to know about me? Aneski broke the silence first, pulling Flix out of his thoughts. I don't want anyone to know about you, he corrected, turning to the front door. He half expected Ani to make a run for it now that the threat of Casimir was gone, humming in approval when he looked back to find him still waiting there. Pushing open the door, he angled his head toward the opening. Get in. Aneski hesitated for barely a blink of time before practically stomping up the steps. He walked inside as though he weren't heading straight into his own personal jail cell, unabashedly entering the main room. Flix followed, closing and locking the door, all while Ani shamelessly took in the place. Most of the Brummel lived in fancy apartments and high-rises in the center of the city, but Flix preferred his space, especially since his job meant he had to constantly come and go at odd hours. There weren't any security cameras he had to be conscious of here, which meant one less step to worry about when he finished work at 4 a.m. and just wanted to crash for a couple of hours before class. Still, he had heightened security measures in place, including barred windows that would send a message to his multi-slate should anyone attempt to shake or pry them loose. As a person who utilized those as entrances for most of his break-ins, he knew all too well how easy it was to enter one's home through them. The house had 3 levels and was made of concrete, brick, and metal. The living area greeted them first, an L-shaped, dark gray couch pressed beneath a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the street. The glass was bulletproof in one way, so that no one from the outside could ever see the goings-on within. Flix liked natural light, but also his privacy, and this provided him the best of both worlds. Just past the living room, the space turned into the dining area, a solid wooden table with black metal chairs situated around it, occupying that area. A large leafy plant took up that corner, a few other potted bits of greenery dotted around the rest of the first level. The kitchen attached to the dining room, rows of metal shelving on the walls displaying the utensils and other cooking items Flix often used. Aneski took all of this in, and then motioned straight ahead of him, down the single hallway. What's down there? Doesn't matter. Flix hadn't brought him here to take him to bed like a true lover. Ani hadn't earned that right. Get undressed. He startled. Right now? Why? Flix reached into his pocket and pulled out a pocket knife, flicking open the blade. Want me to cut them off of you? If I nick you in the process, it'll be your own fault. This is already me being generous. I didn't get the chance to take off my own clothing, if you recall. He hadn't gotten the chance to do much of anything, actually. Flix had literally woken, already naked and chained, and drenched. He so wouldn't forget that horrible part of this story. He'd get Ani back for that as well, all in due time. Glaring, Aneski started undoing the buttons of his shirt while Flix moved into the living room. Flix gave him his back as he undressed, knowing it would drive the other man crazy being ignored like that, something Ani should have been more careful not to tip off earlier. Pulling open the small drawer in the end table next to the couch, he dropped the knife in and took out a pack of cigarettes Hughes had left during one of his brief visits. He kept telling his fellow Brummel members not to smoke at his place, but Hughes always seemed to forget. Snapping his fingers, Flix used his powers to zap the end of it, lighting the thing and slipping it past his lips before turning around to find Aneski was down to his light gray and navy-striped boxers. Adorable. Stop. He let the cigarette hang from his lips as he watched Ani still, following the order instantly. Was he trying to impress him? Hoping Flix would decide to go easy on him if he cooperated? Not a chance in hell. Come here. He gave a single, curt shake of his head when Aneski took a step forward. Not like that. He smirked. Crawl. Ani scoffed. I'm not doing that. Then I'll call Popcorn and have him do it instead. You wouldn't. He didn't sound very certain despite his assertion. Why, think I can't make him come? Enough with the double entendre. Why are you getting so mad? Because I'm not your damn dog. You're not my little brother. You're not my dog. For someone who's supposedly come here to take his punishment willingly, you've got a lot of complaints. You threatened my friend, and now I'm threatening to lure him here and do to him what I should already be doing to you, Flix reminded coldly. Knees. Now. Aneski slowly got on the ground, not bothering to mask his indignation. Good boy, he sneered, and took a deliberate step back. Crawl for me. When Ani started forward, Flix took pity on him and kept retreating, keeping the pace slow and steady. Once he'd made it to the center of the couch, he twisted on his heel and sat, motioning to Ani with 2 fingers, indicating he could stand. Sit on the table, he instructed. The wooden table was around a foot or so high, close enough that Flix had to adjust his legs when Aneski tried to sit. As soon as he had, Flix captured his jaw and tugged him forward, the end of the lit cigarette hovering dangerously close to the rise of his right cheek. Going to burn me, Flix? Going to beg me not to? Ani went silent. Flix chuckled darkly. Always so damn difficult. You'll do what you want no matter what I say, Ani countered quietly. You always have. He took his cigarette out of his mouth and forced Aneski's head to the side, exposing his neck. Then he brought it close enough to his skin he was certain Ani could feel the threat of heat. Sure enough, Aneski's jaw clenched tightly as he braced himself. Felt pretty shitty when you burned my ass, Flix said. What were you thinking? Aneski licked his lips, no doubt stalling, and then confessed. I wanted to see if I could do it. That's so. It was pretty obvious the reason he hadn't been traditionally tortured had been because Aneski didn't have the stomach for it. Think I can do it too? Yes. No hesitation this time. Should I? Aneski's gaze shifted to meet his, though he didn't attempt to free himself from Flix's grasp. Do whatever you need to. Just do it quickly so this can be over. Over? He laughed. You've been here less than 10 minutes, and you're already eager to leave? Flix shoved Ani away so the man fell back against the table, and then pressed the tip of the cigarette into his own thigh, effectively putting it out. Ani's eyes went wide. There was a sharp sting, but the pain was fleeting. There and gone in a flash. Hardly anything for someone like Flix. He tossed the bud to the side, not caring where it fell, and rested his arms on his splayed knees. Smoking will kill you. Promise me you'll quit. He waited for a response, lifting a brow when one didn't come fast enough. Aneski. Fine. He sat back up. Whatever. Flix held his gaze pointedly. I'll quit, he repeated, looking off to the side now. With a sound of approval, Flix leaned back against the couch. Undo my belt. Aneski's eyes shot to his, but when all Flix did was wait, he eventually gave in, like with everything else. His hands shook slightly as he reached forward, tugging the belt loose and dragging it out of the belt loops. Before he could drop it to the ground, Flix clicked his tongue, stopping him. Put it around your neck. He'd preferred to tie up Ani's hands, but that wasn't nearly threatening enough. If word got out what he'd done, it'd be war between the Brummel and the Shepherds, and there was no contest over who would win. This type of rebellion had to be nipped in the bud now. If he went too easy on him, Aneski might test his luck a second time, and there was no way that type of thing was going to fly. Ani wrapped the black leather around his throat, and then adjusted the strap until it was snug around him, but still loose enough. Flix allowed it, moving to take the end of the belt, so when he dropped back against the couch a second time, it forced Ani closer. He tugged again for good measure, grinning when that caused the younger guy to glare. What was that about not being my bitch, Tiny Terror? He wanted to say something, it was so obvious, but Aneski held himself back. That was absolutely no fun at all. Keep going. He pointed to his pants where he was already semi-hard just from the anticipation. Take me out. I want to, Ani growled under his breath, but Flix caught it. Was that a play on words about wanting to kill me? Does now really seem like the right time to risk talking back? He lifted his hips when Aneski undid his jeans and went to pull his pants and underwear down, his cock springing free. Ani sat back and glowered. What now? Flix grunted. Don't play dumb. Aneski lifted a hand, freezing when Flix growled. I said, he stated, not to pretend like you don't know what's going on here. He looked at him. You really sure I won't bite you? Flix yanked the end of the belt so that Ani fell forward, his cheek brushing against his wet tip before he was able to catch himself with his hands on Flix's thighs. Reeling the material in so there was no chance of him retreating again, Flix tilted his head down at him. "Do it," he dared. "However much blood you draw from me, I'll take tenfold from your friends. I won't just stop at popcorn either. I'll bleed him like a pig at slaughter and move on to the next. Maybe that tall one who showed up alongside him today? Bridger, right?" Aneski seemed surprised he knew his name. Bridger was a medical student at Vale, the same school Flix attended, and he was a shepherd. It would be more ridiculous to assume Flix didn't know. "You really didn't think things through before you acted out, did you?" It was a rhetorical question, and he didn't wait for a response. "Can you get me hard for you, Ani?" "Wouldn't be the first time," he gloated, and Flix narrowed his eyes. "Keep the attitude. No, seriously, every time that smart mouth of yours works overtime, I'll add a notch to the list. Thought you just told me to do something else with my mouth." Flix's dick twitched at the sass, and he smirked. A moment passed where Ani collected himself, and then he shifted on his knees and brought his face closer. His tongue lapped out first, flicking across the tip of Flix's crown. "This isn't a wine tasting," Flix scolded. "Hurry up. If I'm not rock hard within the next 5 minutes." He sucked in a sharp breath when Aneski opened his mouth wide and sucked him down. Tingles shot throughout his entire body at the first feel of that warm cavern, and he groaned and dropped his head back against the cushions, watching as Ani worked him. He kept his hands on Flix's thighs, bobbing his head up and down with his eyes squeezed shut, as though in deep concentration. It was kind of hilarious, but when he rolled his tongue around the underside of his member as he pulled off, Flix forgot all about laughing. How many times had he pictured this? Aneski blowing him. His hand tightened on the end of the belt, but he refrained from forcing the younger man to take him any deeper. This wasn't the punishment part after all. This was a tease. Flix had learned a long time ago people tended to suffer more when they had something taken out from under them. "This what you really wanted, Tiny Terror?" he asked. "Bet it is. Bet you've creamed yourself thinking about it. Thinking about getting to suck me off. Lying awake at night wondering what I taste like." It had to be true because Aneski didn't bother pulling off to deny it. Instead, he kept his eyes closed and continued hollowing his cheeks, dropping all the way down to Flix's base so his cock bumped against the back of his throat. He kept the pace a bit frenzied, possibly taking that threat about 5 minutes seriously. Flix buried his left hand in Ani's red hair, taking a moment to appreciate the silkiness of the strands before gripping and hauling him off. Before Ani could ask why, he dragged him to his feet and flipped him over, slamming him down across the coffee table hard enough that the piece of furniture rattled. Ani struggled as soon as Flix pulled his boxers down, but Flix merely forced his legs apart with his knees, and then settled himself over him with a hand across the back of his neck. "Should have come to me sooner," Flix drawled as he dropped the end of the belt to reach for himself, taking aim at Ani's exposed hole. "Why do you think I filled you with that toy in the first place? Could have made things so much better for yourself if you'd just done the right thing and groveled. But no." He pushed himself inside with one slow pump of his hips, groaning at the tight squeeze around him as he forced his way in past resisting muscle. "Always," he gyrated. "So," bit down at Ani's shoulder, "difficult." Aneski clawed at the table and tried to free himself, but he was no match for Flix, especially not in this position. Discreetly, Flix lifted himself just enough so he could glance down and check to be sure there was no tearing, satisfied when his cock came out still slicked in saliva, but no blood. It would have hurt initially, since he hadn't prepped him at all, but in the same way that cigarette burn had felt to Flix. A flash of pain that quickly dissipated. "Bet you think I don't know about all the dick you've spread these golden thighs for." Flix drove into him with more force, grinning when Aneski cried out, and then ran his fingers through his hair again, raking his nails across the younger man's scalp. "What? Did you really think I didn't recognize you in those films you seem to enjoy making so much? Can't hide from me, Tiny Terror." On impulse, he ran his tongue across the side of Ani's face, the burst of salt somehow making him harder. Though, you really should have tried. He hadn't. A couple of months after Russ's funeral, he'd at least gotten the message and stopped coming around, but he'd never gone out of his way to avoid Flicks. If they happened to be at the same bar, the same club, the same whatever, Ani had always held his head high and blatantly stared as if daring Flicks to acknowledge him. Flicks never had. Go out of my way to do you a favor, and this is how you repay me? He snorted and thrust in so hard he practically ground his hip bones against Ani's plush ass. I even looked the other way when you started fucking around. Tell me, which one of those filthy pricks took your virginity, huh? Aneski moaned and tried to turn his head, but Flicks held him steady with his left cheek pressed to the polished wood. Tell me, he barked, settling more of his weight over him, crushingly. Ani gasped. Flicks, please. Wrong name, he growled. I sure as hell would remember if it'd been me. That's not funny. Didn't mean for it to be. He wasn't even sure why it was suddenly so important or what he planned to do once he did know, but Flicks had to. All those years of patience and self-control went straight out the window. With every thrust of his cock, the urge grew more and more. Name. Now. Flicks. Amneski was panting, his cheeks flushed, his hair starting to stick to his forehead. Flicks. Stop calling me, he growled. I want a name. A real name. Bitesi. He clenched down around him, and they both moaned. Please, please. Flicks grabbed him, peeling him off the table. Wrapping an arm around his waist, he kept himself buried to the hilt as he dropped back on the couch, Aneski's legs spreading around his. He held the younger man close, his back against his chest, and started fucking up into him, spurred on by the little mewling noises Ani started making as he thrashed and writhed in his grasp. His other hand captured Ani's dick, pumping him in time with his thrusts. For a moment, Flicks got lost in the sensations, in the sounds and the smell and the feel of the other man completely in his control. His balls drew up, signaling he was close, and his hand quickened its motions, intent on bringing Ani there first. Less than a minute later, he achieved his goal. Aneski twitched against him, practically screaming as he came. He was still in the process of it when Flicks shoved him forward yet again, splaying him over the table a second time. He pulled his cock out of that tight hole and rubbed himself off the rest of the way. It only took 3 pumps of his fist, and then he was coming as well, splattering his release all across Ani's back. The orgasm took forever, because every time he looked at the belt wrapped around his neck, or the way his hole was still puckered and fluttering, he felt another wave zap through him. It was tempting to close his eyes and take a break once he was finally spent, but Flicks couldn't risk letting his guard down, not before his tiny terror was fully secured. He planted one knee against the table next to Ani's side, and then slipped 2 fingers beneath the leather belt, leaning down to kiss the curve of his ear. I wonder how long it'll take for my cum to dry on your skin. No. Flicks shoved him back down, and then used his powers, letting a couple of tiny shocks of electricity slip directly from his fingers into Ani. The younger man jerked once, and then went still, completely knocked out. Years of practice on his own had allowed him to properly gauge how much voltage it would take to render someone unconscious without doing any real damage. Pleased with his handiwork, Flicks sighed and sat back on the couch. His good mood didn't last long, however. It started to sour the instant he recalled he'd never gotten that name. Chapter 9. Aneski was woken by the press of insistent fingers wiggling their way inside of him. He gasped, panicking as his mind scrambled to drag itself from slumber. It was the night before his brother's funeral, and to help cope, he'd gone to bed in Russ's room, alone. He'd even locked the front door, so... Shh. A rumbly voice coaxed, the heavy body that'd been pinning him to the mattress shifting slightly, but not freeing him. Relax, baby. It's me. Ani blinked, but in the darkness of the room, he couldn't see much aside from the outline of the person when he twisted his head. Still, he'd recognize that voice anywhere. Flix? He hummed in confirmation and bent down to suck lightly at Aneski's neck, making a sound of contrition when it tickled, and Ani tried to move away. Do you hate me that much? I'm sorry, so sorry. Why are you slurring your words? He tried to roll over, but then that hand was back, shoving itself between his cheeks, and he went still. What are you doing? Opening you up for me. Flix kissed his neck again, his tongue slipping out to lick at the spot a second after. Relax. It'll be good, so good. Be good for me, baby. Let me in. He worked a single digit inside, pausing when Ani cried out at the intrusion. That hurt? No, it just... He blew out a breath. Feels weird. Give it a moment. Are you drunk? He definitely was, but Aneski was sort of at a loss for words. He'd cried himself to sleep, again, and wasn't exactly in the right state of mind either, but at least he wasn't inebriated. Why do you keep calling me that? Why are you doing this to me? Doing what? Flix tossed the blanket off of them, and Ani realized with a start that they were both completely naked. He shifted over him, using his legs to part Aneski's so he could press another finger past that tight ring of muscle. How's that? If it hurts, it doesn't hurt. What the hell was he saying? He should be telling Flix to stop. Should be shoving him away and turning on the light and demanding to know where the hell he'd been these past couple of days. But maybe it was because he was mentally drained. Ani didn't do any of those things. I can take it. Truthfully, it did kind of hurt a little. He'd never done this with anyone before, not even a girl. There was no way he was about to admit he was a virgin, even though he was only 18. He wasn't about to say or do anything that could risk putting an end to this. Only Pitesi. The word was barely whispered off his lips, but he had to at least know that much. Had to confirm whether or not Flix even knew who he was trying to fuck. This was Russ's room after all, and the two of them had had that kind of relationship. Flix was clearly wasted. What if he thought Aneski was Russ right now? Would Ani tell him the truth? Would he be a total monster if he didn't? Russ was older and would never have called Flix that, and it felt like a lifetime passed while he held his breath and waited for a response. What? Flix asked, dragging his tongue from the base of Ani's neck down to the curve of his spine before he lifted himself onto his knees. He pulled Aneski up, rearranging him so that his bottom half was aloft and he was also kneeling. Aneski made a sound of alarm before he could help it and buried his face against the pillow in a poor attempt to muffle it. His heart was racing in his chest, and a part of him felt disgusted with himself for how excited he suddenly was. His brother was dead, yet he was feeling happiness? Gross. Tilt your hips for me, Ani, Flix said then, calling him by the name only he was allowed to call him. No one had ever even tried giving him a nickname before, honestly. Only Flix. Flix was the only one who ever paid attention to him. Like he was doing now, with his fingers delving in and out of his hole as he stretched him and felt at his insides. He did as he was told, widening his stance to give the older man better access, shaking in anticipation mixed with a dash of fear all the while. Is it going to hurt a lot? He set his pride aside and blurted. What was that? Flix leaned in closer. Right. He'd been speaking into the pillow. He tilted his head. I'm afraid of pain. He shushed him comfortingly. It'll hurt at first, but I'll try my best to make that part pass quickly. Promise? Yeah. I promise? Someone laughed. I'm not sure I can do that. Aneski came to slowly, groggy and weak, with his head spinning. Something rumbled beneath him, something warm, and he tried shifting, gasping when the movement caused a pulsing sensation deep inside of him. A hand settled over the back of his head, keeping him in place. Not that he had the energy to even attempt lifting it yet, his ears starting to focus enough to pick up on the conversation that had no doubt been what had woken him in the first place. "I just wanted to call to thank you again," the voice continued, light and friendly. "Flix." It was Flix's voice. What the? The hand tightened on his skull when he tried to wiggle his hips a second time, but it wasn't necessary. Like being doused in ice water, Aneski finally realized where he was. In Flix's lap, with his head resting on his shoulder and his arms at his sides, impaled by that massive cock he used to be so fixated on. Judging by the way his muscles ached, he'd guessed he'd been in that position for a while, speared by Flix's dick, draped over him like some sick trophy. Their chests were pressed together, meaning he was facing in the opposite direction, his vision finally focusing and taking in a packed bookshelf. This was a room he hadn't seen earlier. He must be in a different part of the house. That's not really necessary," a female voice said, making Ani freeze all over again. It was also familiar. "Why?" "Of course it is, Samara," Flix replied, with the added audacity of patting Aneski's head. "I never would have found this one without your help. He's a handful, but then, you already knew that." He laughed like they were sharing a friendly joke. Ani wondered if he was the only one who noted how fake it came off. Samara? Why was Flix talking to her? "Oh no," she immediately denied it. "No, we don't know each other that well." "Really? It sounded like you were close when we spoke at Guest." "They talked at Guest?" "Not at all," she insisted. "For example, I never even knew he had a tattoo on his neck." "Who had a tattoo where? Were they not talking about him?" "Do you like it?" Flix brushed the hairs on the base of Ani's skull up, exposing his nape. "I did it myself." "He did what himself?" "Hold on. Did she like it?" "Is that a lightning bolt?" she tentatively asked. "It is," Flix said proudly, smoothing Aneski's hair back down. "It looks great." Looks. Good light. Were they on a video call? Ani still couldn't move much, but he managed to get control of his hands, turning them to grab onto Flix's side. "Oh, looks like he's waking." Flix acted like he wasn't aware he'd been awake for a while already. "Anyway, thanks again. The three of us should grab lunch next time I'm near campus." "I'm pretty busy with finals coming up," Samara said, "but maybe." "Really? Well, we'll see then. Have a good rest of your night." "You too." The beep indicating the video chat had been cut came less than a second after her parting words. Flix laughed. She couldn't wait to get away. "Don't you agree, Tiny Terror?" He hummed to himself. "Probably has something to do with your current state of undress. Oh, and maybe all the dried spunk on your back." "What?" His throat was dry, and he had to pause and try again. "What did you do?" "Relax," Flix told him. "The camera is angled to only show us from the chest up. She had no idea you've been writing me this whole time." "I have not." "I suppose that's true. You've mostly just been sitting on my dick like a dead weight. Now that you're up, care to get to work?" He slapped Aneski's right ass cheek, chuckling when he jerked in response. There were so many questions swirling around in his head, but he couldn't seem to get a hold of any of them. All he could do was continue to rest over Flix and try to move his hands. Why? Struggling? Flix cradled him closer, moving to wrap his other arm around Aneski's waist. "Give it another few minutes. You've been unconscious for almost 4 hours. It's going to take some time to come to your senses." "Flix." "What? You didn't really think that was all there was to your punishment, did you?" No, he hadn't, but still, it hurts. His body had been stretched for too long of a period and his thighs were burning. Not to mention how foreign it felt to be stuffed this full. He wiggled his hips, but Flix instantly dropped a hand to his lower back, stopping him. "Don't," he warned. "You're too dry down there. You might tear yourself." Believe it or not, blood as lube isn't really all that appealing to me. Hold on. He reached for something, jostling Ani in the process, who winced as he was moved, and that steel-like rod shoved inside of him hit at a different angle. Flix rested back a second later, and the pop of a top came a moment before a cold squirt of something dripped down Aneski's crease. Should I empty the whole bottle? What is that? I just told you. Lube. Why? He couldn't seriously be planning on fucking him again. Like this? Here? You sound scared, Ani, Flix replied, dropping a chaste kiss on the top of Aneski's left shoulder. It's about time. You're such a bastard. Am I? Flix sounded genuinely saddened by that fact, but Ani knew it was a lie. As if to prove that fact, he followed it up with, how about this? Every time you manage to lift yourself off me, I'll give you a question. What? He was either too out of it to follow, or that was cryptic as all hell. Probably a bit of both. I'm telling you to ride me for real, Flix reiterated. I was planning on fucking you anyway, but I'll have mercy on you this once, since you seem to be having such a poor reaction to having been knocked out. How had he been knocked out? He couldn't recall being given a drug. Maybe Flix had used the belt to cut off his air supply? What do you say, Tiny Terror? He asked. Care to give it a go? His fingers curled against Flix's ribs when he wanted them to. A good sign he was regaining motor functions. I do this and you answer my questions? Only as many as you can drag out of me. Stop it. What? You said drag on purpose. Yeah, because I want to drag my cock against your inner walls. It's a shame Samara couldn't stick around to see the show. Aneski ground his teeth and inhaled before straightening. The room spun at first, and his hands moved to Flix's shoulders to steady himself as he waited for it to pass, but it didn't take long. Once he was in the clear, he risked looking at Flix's face, his heart kicking up several notches the second their eyes locked. For all the calm he'd been speaking with, Flix's pupils were noticeably blown. Obviously, he'd known the Brummel member was horny, but the way he was currently nibbling his bottom lip and staring at Ani like he wanted to consume him raw, he shivered. Well, Flix urged. Aneski felt his insides clench, but forced himself to focus. You're punishing me by making me fuck you? Flix didn't reply at first and then merely stated, something like that. And you'll really answer my questions if I do? Like I said, he shrugged. Every time you pull off, I'll let you ask me one thing. Aneski tried to find the hidden trap, but it eluded him. He ended up giving in and nodding once. Plant your feet on the floor, Flix instructed. He did as he was told. There you go, he praised. Now lift. Flix settled his hands on Ani's waist, but didn't help him move. His muscles burned as he struggled to lift himself, the pain only easing once the thick cockhead inside of him dragged against his prostate, causing his nerves to tingle. He hissed and almost dropped back down, pushing with his hands against Flix's shoulders to keep himself upright. It was slow going, his cock seemingly never ending as he came off inch after inch. He was starting to think he'd just forgotten about there being a drug, because he was far too weak and out of it for Flix to have merely choked him earlier. Just as he was about to pop off the head, Flix's hands pressed on his waist, and the next thing he knew, he was being shoved back down. He screamed as that wide cock was forced back inside of him, gasping for air as Flix pinned him down and ground up into him. Too deep, he hit at his shoulders. It's too deep. It's just right, actually, Flix disagreed, hands slipping to cup his ass cheeks. He kneaded them in his palms but changed his movements so he was only lightly rocking against him now. Good job, baby. Ask me your question. His question? How am I meant to concentrate with you tearing me in half like this? He demanded, only realizing his mistake when he caught the flash of triumph in Flix's gaze. Wait, no. Too late, Flix said. To answer you, I guess you're just going to have to try your best, aren't you? Fuck you. That's the game, Ani, he replied and spanked him lightly. Up you go. If at first you don't succeed. Aneski dug his fingernails into his skin, but Flix didn't so much as flinch. With a growl, he tried standing a second time, relieved when it was easier than it'd been the first, though the ache in his rear had doubled after that pounding. This time, he was a bit more prepared for it, bracing the second he felt himself reach Flix's crown. Only, like a true devil, Flix switched things up on him for shits and giggles. He slowly eased Ani back down this round, carefully taking his time with it until he had himself fully cradled within his body once more. Then he reached between them and wrapped his fingers around Aneski's dick, swirling his thumb through the wet mess leaking from his tip. Next question, baby, he cooed. Determined not to waste it this time, even with Flix's hand working him in the front distractedly, Ani sorted through his thoughts. There were so many things he needed to know, but why were you talking about a tattoo? He shook his head and absently rocked his hips on Flix as his dick was stroked in time to the beating of his heart. I don't have a tattoo on my neck. Sure you do. He frowned, but when Flix didn't elaborate, couldn't hold back a whine. Flix, please. It's fairly simple, he surprisingly conceded and offered. You marked me with your cigarette, I marked you back. His hand went to his nape, but Aneski couldn't feel anything. You burned me? Of course not, Flix scowled, his hand pausing around Ani's dick. In a bid for him to continue, Ani started rising again without having to be prompted. The rush of stimulation must have also given him a burst of energy, because he sat back down before Flix had a chance to pull him back, tightening around that hot member for good measure. Flix moaned and started pumping him again, just like Ani had wanted, a bit distracted himself this time when he muttered, Question. He was about to ask what he'd marked him with, but that was also obvious. The conversation came back to him in greater detail now that he was somehow focusing better. Tattoo. Duh.